Settle in and welcome to HistSleep. Today, we gently uncover the hidden origins of Christmas traditions, ancient customs and quiet rituals that have shaped the way we celebrate, often without us even realizing. Long before twinkling lights adorned trees, before stockings hung by chimneys with care, and long before jolly men in red suits became the central figure of December celebrations, there existed a quieter, subtler world in which the earliest whispers of what we now know as Christmas slowly began to take form. The story begins not in the glittering markets of 19th century Europe, nor in the bustling department stores of modern America, but in the simple rhythms of human life, shaped by the seasons. Winter, with its long nights and biting cold, has always demanded attention and reverence from those who lived closely with the land. In the northern reaches of Europe, people observed the lengthening of nights with a mixture of awe and trepidation, sensing that these dark months held both danger and promise. Fires were lit not only to provide warmth, but to mark a symbolic resistance to the encroaching darkness, a beacon of hope and continuity in a world governed by cycles beyond human control. In these early communities, ritual was not a matter of entertainment, but of survival and psychological solace. Humans have always sought patterns, and the cycles of light and dark, growth and decay, were perhaps the first stories ever told. Celebrations marking the Winter Solstice, the shortest day and the longest night, offered a communal reassurance that spring would indeed return, that crops would grow again, and that life would continue. These early winter observances, now largely forgotten, would eventually form the foundation of the customs we recognize today as Christmas. Among the many ancient cultures, the Romans observed Saturnalia, a festival held in mid-December that honored Saturn, the god of agriculture and time. Saturnalia was a time of feasting, gift-giving, and temporary inversion of social norms. Slaves were allowed to dine alongside their masters. Laughter was encouraged, and everyday routines were suspended. While it may seem frivolous to us now, these customs had profound significance for the communities that practiced them. They were a ritualized assertion of social balance, a way to ensure cohesion in the midst of the harsh winter months. It is from these celebrations, with their mingling of joy, ritual, and community, that some of the earliest strands of modern Christmas traditions can be traced. Yet, as the Roman Empire gave way to the Middle Ages, these ancient practices did not vanish entirely. They transformed. Pagan symbols and rituals were quietly absorbed into the fabric of emerging Christian observances. Early Christians, seeking to celebrate the birth of Christ, often adapted existing winter festivals to fit their theological framework, a process that would ensure continuity of ritual while subtly redefining its meaning. In this sense, Christmas did not appear suddenly, fully formed on December 25th. Rather, it emerged gradually, like a melody woven from multiple, often conflicting threads of human custom. The earliest recorded celebrations of Christ's birth were simple and solemn. Candlelight and prayer replaced feasts and revelry. Monasteries would ring bells to announce the coming of the season, and communities gathered for shared readings and hymns. Yet even in these austere beginnings, the echoes of older pre-Christian practices could be detected. Evergreens brought indoors to symbolize life amid winter's death, the use of fire to repel darkness, and communal gatherings that reinforce social bonds. These echoes were not coincidental. They were practical, cultural, and deeply ingrained in the human psyche. Saint Nicholas, a historical figure who would later evolve into the legendary Santa Claus, lived in the 4th century in what is now modern-day Turkey. Known for his generosity and quiet acts of charity, Nicholas embodied principles that resonated deeply with communities struggling through the uncertainties of life in a time of political upheaval and economic instability. His life, while largely shrouded in legend, inspired rituals of gift-giving that would eventually merge with other cultural traditions to form one of the most recognizable aspects of contemporary Christmas. Yet even here, there is subtlety. The gifts were not commercialized commodities, but small tokens intended to relieve hardship, reinforce social cohesion, and express care in tangible, meaningful ways. As centuries passed, the quiet whispers of these early traditions traveled across Europe. They were reshaped, localized, and adapted by communities whose survival depended upon ritual, shared belief, and an acknowledgement of the cyclical nature of the world around them. The winter season, with its long nights and short days, demanded reflection, gratitude, and hope, qualities that would eventually be codified into the modern holiday, though often in forms unrecognizable to those early celebrants. In the flickering candlelight of medieval homes, the hum of chants, the scent of herbs, and the glow of fires all combined to create a tapestry of experience that would influence Christmas observances for generations to come. It is fascinating to consider that many of the customs we take for granted today are the product of centuries of quiet adaptation. They did not appear overnight, nor were they invented by a single individual or culture. They are the echoes of countless human choices, small acts of continuity, and ritualized responses to the natural world. When we hang a sprig of holly or light a candle in December, we participate, often unknowingly, in a centuries-long dialogue between past and present. Even in America, where many of the Christmas traditions were transplanted from European settlers, the origins are layered and complex. Early colonial communities had their own interpretations, some embracing festive rituals with enthusiasm, others resisting them entirely. Puritan settlers, for example, viewed the celebration of Christmas as frivolous or even morally suspect, suppressing public observances while allowing private, subdued family rituals to persist. These conflicting attitudes shaped the evolution of Christmas in the New World, creating a uniquely American blend of restraint, festivity, and eventually commercial celebration. It is in understanding these subtle beginnings, the whispers of ancient rituals, the quiet acts of generosity, and the cautious adaptations of imported customs that we gain a richer appreciation for the holiday as we know it today. Christmas is not merely a season of cheer, but a living tapestry of human history, woven from countless threads of belief, adaptation, and continuity. By tracing these origins, we come to see the holiday not only as a cultural phenomenon, but as a reflection of the human desire for light in the darkness, for community amid isolation, and for meaning in the cycles of life and nature. The winter solstice has long held a quiet, almost mystical place in the rhythms of human life. Even before the calendars of modern civilization were set in stone, ancient communities observed the passage of the seasons with careful attention, noting the lengthening and shortening of days, the subtle shifts in the sun's path across the sky, and the predictable patterns of growth and decay in the natural world. Among these celestial markers, the solstice, the day when daylight is at its briefest and darkness reigns supreme, stood out as a moment both of reflection and of hope, a liminal point where the old year waned and the new began its slow ascent. For many early societies, the solstice was more than a simple astronomical event. It was a profound symbol, a way to make sense of the unpredictable world around them. In regions where winter brought harsh cold, scarce food, and long nights, Acknowledging this turning point was a vital psychological and cultural practice. Festivals were born from these observations, blending communal gatherings, ritualistic performances, and symbolic gestures that sought to influence the natural order or to offer thanks for survival through the darkest months. These were not holidays in the modern sense, with commercialized trappings or public fanfare, but deeply meaningful observances rooted in necessity, spirituality, and an intimate connection with the cycles of the earth. Across Northern Europe, the solstice was marked with elaborate ceremonies. People would gather around massive fires, both as a practical response to the cold and as a symbolic attempt to push back the darkness. The fires represented life, continuity, and the hope that the sun would return stronger with each passing day. These gatherings often included singing, chanting, and the performance of seasonal rites intended to encourage fertility and ensure that crops would flourish when spring returned. Communities exchanged food and drink, shared stories, and reinforced social bonds through collective participation in these rituals. In doing so, they transformed a purely astronomical moment into a rich cultural practice, one that carried emotional, spiritual, and practical significance. Among the Norse, the solstice period coincided with Yule, a festival that would eventually contribute many elements to what we now recognize as Christmas. Yule celebrations could last for days, encompassing feasts, toasts, and the telling of stories that honored both gods and ancestors. Symbolic acts, such as the burning of the Yule log, were performed to ward off evil spirits and to invite good fortune for the coming year. Evergreen boughs were brought indoors to remind households of life amidst winter's desolation. While these customs may seem quaint today, they were profoundly meaningful to people for whom survival depended upon attention to the cycles of nature and the goodwill of the community. Similarly, in ancient Celtic regions, the solstice was observed with festivals that blended the spiritual and the practical. Ceremonies often took place at sacred sites aligned with solar events, such as stone circles or hilltops, where participants could witness the precise moment of the sun's rebirth. These gatherings were times of reflection and anticipation, where offerings were made, fires were lit, and the community reaffirmed its connection to the land and the cosmos. Rituals included music, dance, and storytelling, practices that not only reinforced social cohesion, but also preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. In the Mediterranean world, too, the solstice held significance. Ancient Egyptians, for instance, celebrated the rebirth of the sun god Ra, whose journey across the sky was intimately tied to the fertility of the Nile and the well-being of their society. In Mesopotamia, winter festivals included offerings to deities and the performance of ceremonies designed to ensure the return of light and the continuation of agricultural cycles. Across civilizations separated by geography and culture, a common thread emerges. The solstice, as the shortest day, was a pivot point, a time to acknowledge the fragility of life while embracing the promise of renewal. It is fascinating to consider how these ancient festivals, each culturally distinct, share underlying similarities with modern Christmas observances. Feasting, the use of fire, communal gatherings, music, and symbolic decorations all echo elements found in today's holiday traditions. Even the concept of gift-giving has distant analogs in solstice festivals, where offerings were exchanged not as commercial transactions, but as gestures of goodwill, sustenance, and solidarity. These parallels suggest that what we now celebrate as Christmas is not an invention of a single time or place, but a tapestry woven from centuries of human practice, observation, and adaptation. In Northern Europe, for instance, the Yule log was more than decoration. A massive piece of wood, often chosen with care from the forest, would be brought into the home and burned over the course of several days. Each part of this ritual carried symbolic weight. Sparks flying from the log were considered omens. Ashes were preserved for protection or fertilization of the land, and the act of sharing firelight and warmth reinforced communal bonds. While modern Christmas often includes a smaller, ornamental version of the Yule log, the essence of the ritual, a communal act centered on light, warmth, and the promise of continuity, remains embedded in the holiday's cultural DNA. Similarly, greenery played a central role in ancient solstice celebrations. Holly, ivy, and pine were not chosen merely for their aesthetic appeal, but for their symbolic significance. Their ability to remain alive and green through winter made them emblems of resilience, life, and hope. These plants were incorporated into homes, altars, and ceremonial spaces, connecting human beings to the natural world even in the depths of winter. Today, the evergreen Christmas tree stands as a direct descendant of this ancient symbolism, a living emblem of continuity and renewal that quietly bridges past and present. Music, too, was an integral part of these early celebrations. Chanting, drumming, and singing served both practical and symbolic purposes, coordinating communal activity, marking the passage of ritual time, and evoking emotional responses that reinforced a sense of shared identity. Carols, as we know them now, evolved from these practices, initially sung outdoors, sometimes door to door, and later incorporated into formal religious services. These songs often carried moral lessons, recounted heroic deeds, or simply celebrated the turning of the seasons, highlighting the human need to express joy, hope, and continuity through sound. Another crucial element was the marking of time through ritual. Calendars as we know them were not universal, and the solstice served as a reliable temporal anchor. By orienting festivals around this astronomical event, ancient communities could structure agricultural and social life in a coherent way, ensuring that key activities, planting, harvesting, communal gatherings, occurred at the optimal moment. These rituals, anchored in the solstice, gave structure to life in ways that were both practical and spiritually reassuring. The solstice, then, was more than a single day. It was a season of heightened awareness, a time when the boundary between the natural and supernatural, the past and future, felt especially thin. Offerings were made to deities, ancestors were honored, and the community reaffirmed its place in the ongoing cycles of life. In these acts, we can trace the roots of many Christmas traditions, the emphasis on light amidst darkness, the gathering of family and community, the giving of gifts as expressions of goodwill, and the celebration of continuity in the face of uncertainty. Even as Christianity spread across Europe, absorbing and transforming local practices, these solstice festivals left their mark. Early Christian leaders often chose December 25th not arbitrarily, but strategically, aligning the celebration of Christ's birth with existing festivals of light, life, and renewal. By doing so, they ensured both continuity and acceptance, allowing new religious observances to be layered atop older cultural traditions. This blending of ancient and emergent practices is central to understanding why Christmas feels at once timeless and familiar, even as the specific customs have evolved over centuries. How Roman Saturnalia shaped early celebrations. To understand the origins of many Christmas traditions, one cannot overlook the Roman festival of Saturnalia, a holiday that flourished in the heart of the ancient empire. Celebrated in mid-December in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture, time, and abundance, Saturnalia was a period of extraordinary social release, marked by feasting, gift-giving, and the temporary suspension of conventional social hierarchies. In many ways, it was the precursor to some of the customs we now consider integral to the modern Christmas season, yet it was also deeply embedded in the context of Roman religious, social, and cultural life, a complexity often lost in the casual observance of contemporary holidays. Saturnalia was more than a single day of celebration. It could extend for a week, and in some accounts, even longer. The festival typically began with a public ritual at the Temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum, where offerings were made, prayers recited, and the statue of Saturn was ceremoniously unbound, a symbolic gesture reflecting freedom, release, and the cyclical renewal of life. This unbinding contrasted sharply with the rigidity of ordinary Roman religious practice, emphasizing the unique liminal quality of the festival. Outside the temple walls, the city would transform. Normal work was suspended, schools closed, courts ceased to function, and a palpable sense of festivity overtook the streets. One of the most remarkable aspects of Saturnalia was its inversion of social norms. Slaves, who typically endured harsh labor and strict discipline, were given a temporary license to participate as equals with their masters. They dined at the same tables, engaged in games, and could even offer playful criticism of their owners without fear of punishment. This temporary suspension of hierarchy was not merely entertainment. It was a ritual acknowledgement of the social order's limits, a controlled release of tension that allowed communities to reinforce stability in the long term. By permitting a brief period in which the ordinary rules were overturned, Saturnalia maintained a delicate balance between authority and freedom, order and chaos. Feasting lay at the heart of the festival. Romans prepared elaborate meals featuring foods that were not commonly consumed during ordinary days, emphasizing abundance, indulgence, and communal enjoyment. The dining experience was communal and theatrical, often including music, recitations, and dramatic performances. These feasts were occasions not only for sustenance, but also for reinforcing bonds within families, neighborhoods, and social networks. In this way, the festival connected individuals to both their immediate community and the broader Roman civilization, fostering a sense of shared identity and continuity. Gift-giving, another hallmark of Saturnalia, provides a particularly direct link to modern Christmas customs. Romans exchanged small tokens, often figurines, candles, or other symbolic items as gestures of goodwill and social connection. While these gifts lacked the commercialized sheen of contemporary holiday shopping, they carried profound social meaning. To give a gift was to acknowledge the recipient's presence within the community, to reinforce alliances, and to participate in a network of reciprocity that underpinned Roman social life. The essence of this practice, the symbolic act of offering something from oneself to another, remains embedded in modern traditions of exchanging presents during the holiday season. In addition to feasting and gift-giving, Saturnalia was marked by music, dance, and gambling, creating an atmosphere of controlled revelry. The city streets were alive with the sound of laughter, singing, and celebration, a stark contrast to the often rigid formality of daily Roman life. Statues and homes were decorated with greenery, including laurel and ivy, echoing a deep-seated human desire to bring signs of life and continuity indoors during the winter months. These decorative practices, rooted in symbolism and seasonal awareness, would later influence European Christmas customs, particularly the use of evergreens in domestic and religious spaces. Saturnalia also emphasized playfulness, humor, and satire. During the festival, it was common for people to exchange humorous verses, engage in wordplay, and even mock public figures in a manner that would be unacceptable at other times. This aspect of the holiday reinforced social cohesion by allowing individuals to release tension through laughter and creativity, creating a shared cultural experience that transcended the strict boundaries of class, age, and occupation. In this sense, the festival was as much about psychological and social balance as it was about religious observance. Interestingly, Saturnalia's timing in mid-December coincided with the Winter Solstice, linking the festival to natural cycles of light and dark. As previously noted, many ancient cultures marked this astronomical turning point with rituals emphasizing renewal, hope, and continuity. Saturnalia, with its emphasis on abundance, generosity, and communal joy, resonated deeply with these themes. The overlap between solstice celebrations and the festival of Saturn created a symbolic environment in which light, life, and social harmony were celebrated simultaneously, a layering of meaning that enriched the cultural texture of the season. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, many pagan traditions, including elements of Saturnalia, were adapted and transformed into Christian observances. Early church leaders, recognizing the popularity and significance of these midwinter festivals, often sought to incorporate existing customs into new religious frameworks rather than attempt outright suppression. By aligning the celebration of Christ's birth with the temporal space previously occupied by Saturnalia and solstice festivals, early Christians could maintain continuity of ritual while gradually infusing it with theological significance. This blending of old and new, pagan and Christian, is a defining characteristic of Christmas traditions as they developed through late antiquity and into the medieval period. Even linguistic traces of Saturnalia persist in the words and phrases associated with contemporary holiday cheer. Greetings of goodwill, expressions of lightheartedness, and references to communal enjoyment echo the playful, generous spirit of the festival. The emphasis on generosity, reflection, and temporary suspension of normal obligations is subtly preserved in modern customs, though often stripped of their overt religious or civic context. By understanding Saturnalia, we gain insight not only into the historical origins of Christmas customs, but also into the human desire for shared ritual, emotional release, and celebration of continuity amid uncertainty. Furthermore, the influence of Saturnalia extended beyond the city of Rome into the provinces of the empire, shaping local practices and seasonal observances. In regions such as Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, Roman settlers and local populations blended Saturnalia with indigenous festivals, creating hybrid celebrations that bore the hallmarks of both traditions. This cultural diffusion reinforced the adaptability of these rituals, allowing them to survive and evolve even as political regimes changed, populations shifted, and religious practices transformed. Saturnalia's emphasis on family, community, and social harmony set a precedent for many aspects of Christmas as it later emerged in Europe and America. The act of gathering together to share food, exchange gifts, and participate in collective rituals is at the core of both festivals, reflecting a universal human inclination toward connection and continuity. Even in societies that eventually adopted Christianity, these behaviors proved resilient, integrated seamlessly into religious observances, and eventually became normalized components of the holiday season. In considering Saturnalia's legacy, it is striking how many seemingly modern elements, decorations, communal feasting, gift exchanges, music, and playful inversion of social norms can be traced back to these ancient Roman practices. While the symbolic meanings have shifted over centuries, the structural and emotional frameworks remain. The festival illustrates how cultural practices are rarely invented in isolation. They emerge from layers of history, adapted to new contexts, yet preserving echoes of their origins. By tracing the lineage of Christmas customs back to Saturnalia, we recognize the holiday not simply as a religious or commercial phenomenon, but as a living testament to human creativity, resilience, and the desire for shared ritual, light and abundance, and social connection.
From pagan rituals to Christian observances. As the Roman Empire gradually embraced Christianity, the landscape of religious and cultural practice began to shift in profound and often subtle ways. Pagan festivals, long intertwined with the rhythms of agricultural and seasonal life, did not vanish overnight. Instead, many of these ancient customs were adapted, reinterpreted, and absorbed into emerging Christian observances, creating a layered tapestry of ritual, symbolism, and social meaning that would eventually evolve into the holiday we now know as Christmas. This process of transformation was neither uniform nor immediate, and it reflects the pragmatic, sometimes cautious approach of early church leaders seeking to establish continuity while asserting new theological frameworks. The birth of Christ, now celebrated on December 25th, was not originally associated with this specific date. Early Christian communities did not emphasize the exact timing of Jesus' birth. Rather, the theological focus rested on the significance of his arrival, the embodiment of divine promise and redemption. The choice of December 25th as the official date of celebration, established in the 4th century, was influenced heavily by the prevalence of midwinter festivals across the Roman world. By aligning the Christian observance with the timing of established pagan rituals, such as Saturnalia, early church authorities could facilitate the acceptance of the new faith among populations already accustomed to seasonal celebrations of light, life, and renewal. This alignment was strategic and nuanced. Pagan rituals were deeply embedded in the social and cultural fabric of the empire, and outright suppression could provoke resistance or alienation. By overlaying Christian significance onto familiar seasonal practices, the church could preserve the social and emotional functions of these festivals: communal feasting, music, gift-giving, and symbolic decoration, while gradually redirecting their meaning toward the narrative of Christ's birth. This syncretism allowed for continuity of cultural practice, while subtly transforming the underlying theology, a process that would echo throughout the development of Christmas traditions for centuries to come. Early Christian communities approached the integration of pagan customs with care. In some regions, public celebrations were minimized, emphasizing prayer, reflection, and religious instruction. In others, communal feasts, gift exchanges, and music were tolerated, provided they were framed within a Christian context. Symbols such as the evergreen, fire, and light, previously associated with solstice observances, were reinterpreted as expressions of eternal life, divine illumination, and spiritual hope. Thus, the physical and ritual elements of pagan festivals were preserved, even as their symbolic meanings shifted, allowing communities to retain familiar patterns while embracing new religious identities. In Northern Europe, for instance, the Yule celebrations, deeply rooted in pre-Christian solstice rituals, were gradually incorporated into Christian practice. The burning of the Yule log, once a ritual aimed at ensuring fertility and protection against malevolent spirits, took on Christian overtones. The fire symbolized the light of Christ entering the world, and the act of gathering around it became a focal point for family and community devotion. Similarly, feasts and communal gatherings, previously intended to honor gods and ancestors, were reframed as celebrations of divine providence and the joy of salvation. These adaptations demonstrate the fluidity of cultural rituals and the human capacity to reinterpret long-standing practices within new ideological frameworks. The figure of the bishop St. Nicholas also illustrates the blending of pagan and Christian influences. While Nicholas's historical life as a 4th century Christian bishop in Myra is documented, the legends surrounding his generosity, gift-giving, and secret acts of kindness were often integrated with pre-existing winter customs. In some regions, the timing and style of gift exchanges echoed Saturnalia traditions, while the theological framing aligned these acts with Christian moral teachings. The merging of legend, ritual, and practical action created a template for the broader incorporation of cultural motifs into the Christian calendar, demonstrating how folklore and formal observance can coexist and enrich one another. Music, an essential element of both pagan and early Christian festivals, underwent a similar transformation. Hymns and chants were developed to celebrate Christ's birth, often borrowing melodic structures and rhythmic patterns from earlier secular or ritual music. Songs of joy, light, and communal participation were thus preserved, even as their thematic content shifted to reflect Christian doctrine. Over time, these musical practices would evolve into the carols and hymns familiar to us today, linking centuries of tradition into a continuous cultural thread. Decorative practices, too, were gradually Christianized. Evergreens, holly, ivy, and mistletoe, long used in pagan solstice rituals to symbolize life, protection, and fertility, were integrated into Christian celebrations of the Nativity. Candles and other sources of light, once used to repel darkness or honor seasonal deities, came to symbolize the presence of Christ, the light of the world. By retaining these visual and symbolic elements, communities were able to preserve continuity in their domestic and public rituals, even as their interpretive frameworks evolved to align with new religious teachings. Gift-giving, perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of both Saturnalia and later Christmas celebrations, reflects a particularly rich convergence of pagan custom and Christian moral instruction. The act of giving, rooted in expressions of goodwill, reciprocity, and social cohesion, was reinterpreted as an embodiment of Christian charity, mirroring the gifts brought to the infant Jesus by the Magi. By framing generosity as both a social and spiritual practice, early Christian observances preserved the emotional and communal functions of earlier festivals while emphasizing moral and religious significance. Feasting, central to both pagan solstice celebrations and Saturnalia, remained a key feature in Christian observances. While some early church authorities attempted to temper excessive indulgence, communal meals continued to serve practical and symbolic purposes. They reinforced bonds among families, neighbors, and larger communities, provided opportunities for shared reflection and storytelling, and underscored the abundance and providence of God. Through these meals, ancient patterns of social interaction persisted, layered with new religious meaning and narrative significance. The transition from pagan rituals to Christian observances was not uniform across Europe. In some regions, pre-Christian practices persisted for centuries alongside official church celebrations, resulting in hybridized forms that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. In others, church authorities exerted stricter control, emphasizing doctrinal orthodoxy and minimizing the influence of older customs. This patchwork of practice created a rich diversity of regional traditions, which, when later transmitted to the Americas and other parts of the world, provided the foundation for the varied and sometimes contradictory forms of Christmas observance we recognize today. Through this blending, the holiday became both familiar and new. Communities retained the comforting patterns of feasting, gift-giving, light, and music, while learning to reinterpret these rituals through a Christian lens. The enduring human desires for social connection, emotional release, and symbolic engagement with the cycles of nature were honored, even as the theological framework shifted. In this way, Christmas emerged not as a sudden invention, but as the result of centuries of cultural negotiation, adaptation, and integration. Even in the private sphere, the Christianization of pagan rituals transformed domestic practices. Families incorporated prayer and religious instruction into celebrations while still engaging in feasts, decoration, and games that echoed earlier customs. The home became a site where continuity and innovation coexisted, and where ritual practices were transmitted across generations, preserving both cultural memory and religious identity. This careful balance between tradition and transformation is central to understanding the development of Christmas as a living, evolving holiday. The narrative of Christmas as it emerged from pagan roots highlights the resilience and adaptability of human cultural practice. Ancient rituals, imbued with practical, symbolic, and spiritual significance, were neither discarded nor forgotten. They were absorbed, reshaped, and reinterpreted in ways that allowed them to endure. The holiday that evolved is a testament to the human capacity for continuity amid change, for preserving the essence of communal experience while reframing its meaning to align with new beliefs. By tracing these origins, we gain insight into the subtle mechanisms through which culture adapts and survives. Pagan rituals were never entirely replaced, they were transformed. Observances once intended to honor deities of agriculture or cosmic cycles became celebrations of divine promise and human community. Practices of feasting, gift-giving, music, and decoration persisted, finding new expression within Christian observance, a testament to the enduring human desire for ritual, reflection, and communal joy.
Saint Nicholas, the man behind the myth. Few figures in the history of Christmas are as universally recognized or as deeply misunderstood as Saint Nicholas. The jolly, gift-giving figure that dominates popular imagination today has roots in a historical bishop who lived in the 4th century, in a time and place far removed from the glittering commercialization of contemporary holiday celebrations. Born in the city of Patara, in what is now modern-day Turkey, Nicholas was raised in a society that straddled the complex intersection of late Roman civic life, emergent Christian doctrine, and the lingering cultural practices of the Greco-Roman world. His life, largely recorded in hagiographies and later embellished through legend, offers a window into how acts of personal virtue and communal generosity can evolve into enduring cultural icons. Nicholas was orphaned at a young age, inheriting a modest fortune from his parents. Rather than securing personal comfort, he devoted himself to charitable works, assisting the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable. His acts of generosity were often discreet. He provided dowries for impoverished young women to prevent their exploitation, aided sailors in peril, and supported orphans and widows with practical assistance. These acts were not motivated by a desire for fame or recognition. They were rooted in deeply held religious convictions and a commitment to social responsibility. The combination of humility, moral integrity, and tangible acts of kindness created a legacy that would resonate across centuries. In the centuries following his death, the stories of Nicholas's generosity became embellished and intertwined with local folklore, particularly in regions of Europe where winter festivals, gift-giving, and seasonal feasts were already established. In some accounts, he was said to have secretly placed gold coins into the stockings or shoes of the needy, an act that formed the narrative template for one of Christmas's most enduring traditions, hanging stockings to receive gifts. These stories were repeated in communities, passed down through oral tradition, and eventually codified in hagiographies, blending historical fact with symbolic meaning in ways that preserve the essence of Nicholas's charitable spirit. Nicholas's significance was amplified by the cultural and religious milieu of medieval Europe. The Christian Church, seeking to cultivate moral exemplars and saints who could inspire lay people, elevated Nicholas to the status of patron saint of children, sailors, merchants, and the poor. His feast day, celebrated on December 6th, became a focal point for charitable giving, reflection on moral responsibility, and community gatherings. In regions such as the Netherlands and Germany, the figure of Sinterklaas emerged, blending Nicholas's historical attributes with local customs and linguistic adaptations. Children were told stories of the saint, who rewarded good behavior and encouraged generosity, reinforcing social norms through narrative and ritual. The transition of Saint Nicholas from historical bishop to legendary figure illustrates the gradual evolution of cultural memory. Legends grew in part because they served practical social functions. They encouraged charitable behavior, reinforced communal bonds, and offered moral instruction in an accessible, engaging form. Over time, Nicholas became increasingly mythologized, his persona absorbing elements of pre-existing folklore, solstice traditions, and seasonal celebrations. The narrative of a benevolent figure delivering gifts during the winter months
dovetailed naturally with midwinter rituals of feasting, generosity, and communal gathering, making him an ideal conduit for integrating earlier customs into emerging Christian practices. In addition to gift giving, Nicholas's association with protection and guidance was central to his legend. Sailors who faced the perils of the Mediterranean and northern seas prayed to Nicholas for safe passage. Merchants invoked him for prosperity in ethical business dealings. Families turned to him for the well-being of children and the protection of their homes. These diverse roles reinforced his status as a universally revered figure, capable of bridging social, occupational, and regional divides. The adaptability of his legend allowed communities across Europe to adopt him in ways that reflected local values and concerns, while maintaining continuity with the broader Christian narrative. When European settlers brought these traditions to the Americas, the figure of St. Nicholas underwent further transformation. Dutch immigrants in particular maintained the Sinterklaas customs, celebrating with gift exchanges, parades, and storytelling. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, the legend evolved further, influenced by American cultural norms, literary depictions, and artistic interpretations. Clement Clark Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, or Night Before Christmas, and later illustrations by artists such as Thomas Nast, codified the visual and narrative aspects of the figure, shaping the modern Santa Claus while preserving echoes of the historical Nicholas's generosity and moral example. Yet, even in the modern Santa Claus, one can detect the subtle imprint of historical and cultural evolution. The emphasis on discretion, thoughtfulness, and reward for virtuous behavior mirrors Nicholas's original acts of quiet charity. The ritual of gift-giving, though now commercialized, retains symbolic resonance. It is a performative act of generosity, a gesture that fosters social bonds, celebrates human connection, and evokes joy. The enduring popularity of this figure attests to the human need for symbols that embody moral ideals, cultural memory, and the emotional resonance of shared tradition. Nicholas's life and legend also highlight the interplay between history, myth, and ritual. While the historical record provides a skeleton of facts, birth, episcopal duties, acts of charity, and death, the fleshing out of his story through legend, art, and communal memory has imbued him with symbolic power far beyond the concrete events of his life. This process, whereby historical figures are transformed into cultural icons, is not unique to Nicholas, but it is particularly instructive in understanding the mechanisms by which traditions evolve and endure. Moreover, the timing of Nicholas's feast in
Medieval Europe and the birth of Yuletide customs. By the time Europe entered the medieval period, the winter celebrations that had evolved from solstice festivals, Saturnalia, and early Christian observances began to coalesce into recognizable Yuletide customs. In the great tapestry of medieval life, marked by castles, monastic centers, bustling market towns, and scattered rural villages, these seasonal rituals provided continuity, comfort, and communal identity in a world often defined by uncertainty. Winters were long, harsh, and unforgiving, and for communities dependent on agriculture, the months surrounding the solstice demanded both practical preparation and symbolic acknowledgement. It is in this context that many of the customs which would eventually feed into modern Christmas celebrations took root. Medieval Europeans approached winter with a combination of pragmatism and reverence. Households stored food for the season, repaired homes to withstand the cold, and prepared for periods when travel would be limited and resources scarce. Within this framework of survival, ritual provided both psychological comfort and social cohesion. Yuletide festivities were moments when normal labor was suspended, when families and communities gathered to share food, and when the symbolic acts of lighting fires, decorating with greenery, and exchanging small tokens reinforced connections among members of society. These customs were not simply entertainment, they were vital tools for sustaining community, morale, and hope through the darkest months of the year. Feasting remained central to Yuletide celebrations in medieval Europe. Nobles, merchants, and peasants alike organized meals that reflected their social status, yet shared the common goal of gathering people together around warmth, nourishment, and conversation. Tables were laden with bread, roasted meats, seasonal fruits, and preserved delicacies, often complemented by spiced wine or ale. In noble households, banquets were accompanied by music, storytelling, and theatrical performances, highlighting the performative and communal dimensions of Yuletide rituals. For peasants and common folk, simpler meals nonetheless served similar purposes, reinforcing bonds, marking the passage of the season, and offering moments of respite from daily labor. Music and song flourished as part of these celebrations. Carols, initially sung outdoors, often door to door, encouraged communal participation and reinforced moral and social narratives. Their lyrics drew on biblical themes, seasonal motifs, and moral lessons, serving both as entertainment and as tools of cultural education. The act of singing collectively fostered a sense of unity and shared experience, echoing ancient traditions in which music marked communal observance and reinforced social cohesion. Through song, medieval communities articulated both their spiritual beliefs and their attachment to seasonal cycles, blending religious and secular themes in ways that resonated across social classes. Decorative practices also became more elaborate during this period. Evergreens, holly, ivy, and mistletoe were brought into homes as symbols of life, protection, and renewal, connecting medieval Europeans to long-standing solstice traditions. Candles and hearth fires illuminated interiors, warding off darkness both physically and symbolically. In some regions, elaborate public displays, such as decorated halls in noble estates or adorned church interiors, created visual markers of the season, celebrating both divine presence and communal prosperity. These decorations were not merely ornamental, they were imbued with layers of meaning, reflecting the interplay of pagan heritage, Christian reinterpretation, and practical engagement with the winter environment.
Gift-giving during Yuletide in medieval Europe was often modest but meaningful. Wealthy families might exchange fine goods or coins, while peasants offered food, handmade items, or small tokens that reflected ingenuity and care. The timing of gift giving varied by region, sometimes associated with St. Nicholas's feast day in early December, and in other areas coinciding with the broader Yuletide celebrations. Gifts served both symbolic and social functions. They were expressions of gratitude, markers of relationships, and means of reinforcing social hierarchies as well as personal bonds. Over time, these practices would become formalized and incorporated into broader Christmas traditions, maintaining their core purpose of generosity and connection. Communal rituals during Yuletide in medieval Europe often included elements of performance and theater. Mystery plays, pageants, and reenactments of biblical stories were staged in town squares, churchyards, and even private homes. These performances blended education, entertainment, and moral instruction, creating shared cultural experiences that linked religious observance with seasonal festivity. The blending of sacred narrative with seasonal celebration reflected the broader integration of Christian and pre-Christian traditions. Rituals of light, fire, and greenery were woven together with storytelling and communal participation, producing a rich and layered cultural fabric. One of the most distinctive features of medieval Yuletide was the emphasis on inversion and revelry. Following the pattern inherited from Saturnalia and other midwinter festivals, social norms were temporarily relaxed. Servants and masters might engage in playful role reversals. Mock kings or Lord of Misrule figures presided over feasts. Jesting and humorous performances allowed communities to release tension accumulated over the year. These practices, while often confined to particular social contexts, reinforced communal bonds, provided psychological relief, and symbolized the temporary suspension of ordinary hierarchies in favor of celebration and unity. Religious observance remained intertwined with these secular elements. Masses, prayers, and devotional practices anchored the celebrations, ensuring that the spiritual dimension of the season was maintained. In monastic communities, liturgical rituals were meticulously observed, with processions, hymns, and readings marking key dates in the calendar. Lay communities adapted these practices to local contexts, blending piety with festivity in ways that were both accessible and meaningful. This integration of sacred and secular elements exemplifies the layered nature of medieval Yuletide, in which multiple influences coexisted and reinforced one another. The visual and material culture of Yuletide in medieval Europe also provides insight into the period's social and symbolic priorities. Hearths, decorated with greenery and illuminated by candlelight, symbolized domestic stability and protection. Tables laden with seasonal foods reflected both agricultural cycles and social hierarchies. Public spaces, adorned for festivals and communal gatherings, created a sense of shared identity and continuity. Through these tangible markers, medieval Europeans engaged in acts of meaning-making, embedding the cycles of nature and cultural memory into the very fabric of daily life. Over time, these practices became increasingly codified and transmitted across regions. While local variations persisted, common patterns emerged. Feasting, music, decoration, gift-giving, communal rituals, and religious observance formed the core of Yuletide celebrations. The blending of influences from solstice festivals, Saturnalia, Early Christian observances and local customs produced a coherent seasonal framework that balanced continuity and innovation. These patterns would endure, providing the structural and symbolic foundation for Christmas traditions in later centuries. Medieval Europe's Yuletide customs also reveal the interplay of power, religion, and culture. Nobility often used festivals to display wealth and reinforce social authority, while commoners participated in rituals that balanced respect for hierarchy with opportunities for playful inversion. Churches sought to maintain doctrinal oversight, shaping religious observance while allowing room for community creativity. The result was a dynamic interplay in which culture, ritual, and belief coexisted.
In tracing these developments, one sees how Yuletide in medieval Europe became a crucible for the traditions that would eventually evolve into modern Christmas. Fire, greenery, music, feasting, gift-giving, communal storytelling, and ritual inversion were preserved, reinterpreted, and transmitted, providing both continuity with the past and adaptability for future generations. The cultural memory embedded in these practices demonstrates the resilience of human ritual and the capacity of societies to blend practical, symbolic, and spiritual needs into coherent, meaningful celebrations. By the end of the medieval period, the foundation of Christmas as we recognize it today had largely been established, a holiday that combined spiritual observance, communal participation, familial bonding, and cultural continuity. The practices of feasting, gift-giving, music, and decoration, rooted in centuries of layered tradition, persisted and evolved, shaping the way communities marked the winter season and transmitted values, beliefs, and joy across generations. The role of music in early Christmas celebrations. From the earliest incarnations of Christmas, music has played a central role in shaping the atmosphere, communal spirit, and ritual significance of the season. Far beyond mere entertainment, music served as a medium for storytelling, spiritual reflection, and social cohesion. In the context of early celebrations, whether in the grand halls of the nobility, the crowded streets of medieval towns, or the modest homes of rural villages, song and instrumental performance provided continuity, emotional resonance, and a means of integrating diverse cultural influences into the fabric of Yuletide tradition. In medieval Europe, the carol emerged as a key vehicle for seasonal music. Originally, carols were not strictly religious. They encompassed dance songs, processional chants, and narrative pieces that celebrated the cycles of the seasons, human virtues, and mythic or biblical stories. Carols were performed both in public spaces, where communities could gather to witness and participate, and in private domestic settings, where families and neighbors joined together in shared celebration. The dual nature of carols, as both secular and sacred, mirrored the broader blending of pagan and Christian elements in early Christmas observances. The musical instruments of the time were diverse, and their use varied by region, social status, and occasion. Lutes, flutes, fiddles, and drums were commonly employed to accompany singing, while bells and organ pipes added ceremonial weight to liturgical celebrations. In churches, choirs performed polyphonic hymns that emphasized the solemnity and spiritual significance of Christ's birth, while in taverns and town squares, more lively tunes invited dancing, communal participation, and festive revelry. This diversity of musical expression ensured that music could address multiple dimensions of the holiday experience: spiritual reflection, emotional release, and social bonding. Song texts, or lyrics, were often didactic, reinforcing moral values, religious teachings, or social norms. For example, many carols told the story of Christ's birth in accessible, memorable language, allowing lay people to engage with sacred narratives, even if they were unable to read or attend formal religious instruction. Others recounted local legends, seasonal lore, or historical events, linking the celebration of Christmas to broader cultural memory.
The oral transmission of these songs ensured that they adapted to local dialects, musical preferences, and social contexts, creating a living tradition that evolved organically over time. Music also served as a bridge between sacred and secular spaces. Church choirs, while performing liturgical pieces, often drew upon melodies familiar from secular songs, adapting them to religious texts. Conversely, secular performers incorporated religious motifs, biblical references, or symbolic imagery into their performances, blurring the lines between devotional and festive music. This interweaving of sacred and secular reinforced the holistic nature of early Christmas celebrations, where spiritual observance, communal enjoyment, and cultural expression were inseparable. The participatory nature of early Christmas music contributed to a sense of communal identity and cohesion. Singing together, whether in church, in public squares, or around the hearth, allowed individuals to feel connected to both their immediate community and a broader cultural heritage. The act of performing music collectively reinforced social bonds, transmitted shared values, and created emotional experiences that were both memorable and meaningful. In this sense, music was not an embellishment, but a central mechanism through which the season's rituals acquired depth, resonance, and continuity. In addition to carols, other musical forms contributed to early Christmas observances. Processional songs accompanied public ceremonies, pageants, and theatrical performances, marking transitions between ritual spaces or stages of narrative storytelling. Instrumental interludes provided rhythm, emotional texture, and cues for dance or dramatic action. Bells, trumpets, and other percussive instruments punctuated celebrations, signaling key moments in communal gatherings, such as
Decorating homes, from evergreens to modern trees. One of the most visually enduring aspects of Christmas, the decoration of homes, finds its roots in ancient and medieval practices that honored the cycles of nature, the promise of renewal, and the continuity of life during the darkest months of the year. The use of greenery, evergreens, holly, ivy, and mistletoe, served both symbolic and practical purposes, and these traditions gradually evolved into the modern practice of decorating Christmas trees, which now adorn homes around the world. Understanding this evolution reveals the intricate interplay of cultural memory, religious adaptation, and aesthetic sensibility that shaped one of the most recognizable features of the holiday. In pre-Christian Europe, evergreen plants held profound symbolic significance. Their ability to remain vibrant throughout the winter months represented resilience, eternal life, and protection against malevolent forces. Communities hung branches over doorways, windows, and hearths to ward off evil spirits, attract good fortune, and remind themselves of the promise of spring. These early practices were deeply rooted in both the practical and spiritual dimensions of human life. Practical because evergreens were readily available, spiritual because they embodied hope, continuity, and the cyclical patterns of the natural world. As Christianity spread, these symbolic meanings were reinterpreted to align with religious narratives. Evergreens came to symbolize eternal life through Christ, while their placement in homes and churches reflected both reverence and celebration. In monastic communities, green garlands were used to adorn altars and sacred spaces during winter observances, blending the visual language of nature with theological reflection. Lay people, too, adopted these practices, incorporating evergreens into domestic spaces to signal both spiritual devotion and seasonal festivity. In this way, the act of decorating homes became a site where religious meaning, cultural tradition, and aesthetic sensibility converged. By the medieval period, decorating practices had become more elaborate. In addition to evergreens, homes and halls were adorned with ribbons, candles, fruits, and other symbolic items. Candles, placed strategically on windowsills, mantels, and tables, provided warmth, light, and a sense of sacred illumination. Fruits such as apples and oranges, often scarce during the winter, represented abundance, prosperity, and divine providence. The integration of these elements created a sensory environment that engaged sight, smell, and touch, enhancing the experience of the season while reinforcing communal and familial bonds. The Yule log, an essential centerpiece in medieval homes, also played a role in decoration. Often carved, adorned, or symbolically marked, the Yule log was placed in the hearth and burned slowly over the course of the festival. Its flames illuminated the room, creating a focal point for gatherings, storytelling, and ritual observance. The ashes of the Yule log were sometimes preserved for use in the coming year, believed to carry protective or prosperous properties. Through this practice, domestic decoration was intertwined with both ritual action and symbolic meaning, demonstrating the functional and spiritual dimensions of festive adornment. The notion of a central tree in the home gradually emerged in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, particularly in regions such as Germany. The paradise tree, often decorated with apples to symbolize the Garden of Eden, was originally associated with religious pageants and public performances in churches and town squares. Over time, this practice migrated from public spaces to private homes, reflecting both cultural adaptation and the desire to bring symbolic narratives into the domestic sphere. The evolution from simple greenery to a fully decorated tree illustrates the layering of symbolism, ritual, and aesthetic refinement over centuries. Decorating practices were not uniform across Europe. Local customs and material availability influenced the forms and content of holiday adornment. In northern regions, pine and fir trees were favored, while in other areas, holly, ivy, and juniper provided greenery.
Candles were used more prominently in some regions, while in others, hanging fruits, nuts, or small figurines took precedence. These regional variations reflected both ecological realities and cultural preferences, yet all shared a common underlying theme: the desire to bring light, life, and symbolic meaning into the domestic space during the winter season. By the early modern period, decorating homes became a multifaceted practice, combining religious symbolism, seasonal celebration, and aesthetic display. Families took pride in adorning their hearths, windows, and central living spaces, integrating greenery, candles, fruits, and symbolic figures. Craftsmen created intricate ornaments, from carved wooden figures to delicate glass spheres, reflecting both artistic skill and cultural imagination. These objects were not merely decorative. They carried layers of meaning, connecting the domestic sphere to broader narratives of spirituality, community, and seasonal cycles. The transformation of these practices into the modern Christmas tree is particularly notable in Germany during the 16th and 17th centuries. Historical records indicate that households began erecting small trees indoors, decorating them with apples, nuts, and other symbolic items. These early domestic trees were often accompanied by candles, which provided illumination and emphasized the tree as a focal point of family gathering. Over time, additional decorations, ribbons, tinsel, and handcrafted ornaments were introduced, reflecting both technological advances and evolving aesthetic preferences. As German traditions spread across Europe and eventually to the Americas, the practice of decorating a central tree became increasingly standardized, yet it retained its symbolic richness. In the 19th century, the Christmas tree gained widespread popularity in England, following its introduction by German princes, and in America through cultural transmission by German immigrants. The integration of lights, ornaments, and gifts beneath the tree further solidified its role as the centerpiece of domestic celebration, a space where communal joy, religious reflection, and aesthetic pleasure converged. The act of decorating, whether with a tree, garlands, or symbolic objects, functioned as a form of cultural expression. It allowed families and communities to visually manifest the values, beliefs, and narratives central to the season. Each ornament, candle, and sprig of greenery carried meaning, reflecting historical continuity, moral instruction, or personal sentiment. The domestic space became a canvas for cultural memory, integrating past traditions into present observances while creating opportunities for creative adaptation and intergenerational transmission. Even in modest households, decoration served as a form of engagement with the broader seasonal culture. Children participated in hanging greenery, arranging candles, or crafting simple ornaments, learning both practical skills and cultural narratives. These activities reinforced communal bonds and provided a tangible connection to the cycles of nature, seasonal rhythm, and spiritual reflection. Through the act of decorating, individuals engaged physically, emotionally, and symbolically with the season, creating experiences that were both personal and collective. Modern Christmas trees, with their electric lights, mass-produced ornaments, and carefully curated displays, are the culmination of centuries of adaptation, innovation, and cultural layering. Yet the essence of the tradition remains rooted in ancient practices: the use of evergreens to symbolize life, the integration of light to represent hope, and the creation of a focal point around which family and community gather. The historical trajectory from simple evergreen boughs to elaborately decorated trees illustrates the enduring human impulse to bring meaning, beauty, and continuity into the domestic sphere during times of seasonal transition. Through the lens of domestic decoration, we can trace the convergence of pagan symbolism, Christian reinterpretation, and aesthetic innovation. The continuity of core elements, evergreens, light, and communal gathering, demonstrates the resilience of cultural memory, while the innovations of ornamentation, tree placement, and illumination reflect human creativity and adaptation. Decorating homes, therefore, is not merely a visual practice. It is a ritualized expression of identity, belief, and communal connection that has persisted across centuries.
The evolution of gift giving through centuries. Gift giving, one of the most enduring and universally recognized elements of Christmas, has a history as layered and intricate as the holiday itself. Far from being a purely modern or commercial practice, the act of exchanging gifts has its roots in a confluence of religious observance, social custom, and symbolic ritual that spans centuries. Understanding how gift-giving evolved offers a lens through which we can trace the development of cultural values, social expectations, and communal identity in Western societies. In early Christian communities, the act of giving was deeply intertwined with moral and spiritual instruction. Inspired by the biblical narrative of the Magi presenting gifts to the infant Jesus, early Christians emphasized generosity as an expression of charity, virtue, and divine favor. Gifts were modest and often practical, aimed at meeting the needs of the recipient while reinforcing ethical obligations. The underlying philosophy was less about celebration or festivity than it was about reinforcing social and spiritual bonds, emphasizing empathy, responsibility, and care for the less fortunate. The integration of gift-giving into the broader calendar of winter celebrations was influenced heavily by pre-existing pagan and seasonal customs. Roman Saturnalia, celebrated in late December, featured the exchange of tokens, coins, and small presents as part of its social festivities. Similarly, midwinter solstice rituals across Europe included the offering of symbolic items to friends, family, and deities, a practice meant to ensure fortune, fertility, and protection in the coming year. Early Christian leaders, recognizing the social and psychological value of these customs, gradually repurposed them, overlaying religious significance while preserving the practical and emotional functions of the act. St. Nicholas, whose legacy we explored in earlier sections, played a central role in shaping the framework of gift-giving traditions. His acts of quiet, discreet generosity, providing dowries for impoverished girls, assisting sailors and orphans, and leaving coins or small gifts for the needy, established a model of giving that emphasized thoughtfulness, moral intent, and community benefit. Over time, his legend became associated not just with charitable acts, but also with the timing of gifts, particularly around his feast day on December 6. This early structure provided a template that would inform later practices of exchanging presents during Christmas proper. By the medieval period, gift-giving had become both a domestic and communal practice. Families exchanged small, practical items, food, clothing, tools, or tokens of affection, while nobles and wealthy merchants often distributed more elaborate gifts to retainers, allies, and clients. The act of giving reinforced social hierarchies, expressed gratitude, and strengthened bonds within and across communities. In urban centers, guilds and merchant associations also engaged in gift exchange, distributing goods to apprentices and employees, thereby institutionalizing the practice in ways that linked economic, social, and moral dimensions of communal life. Ceremonial and symbolic aspects of gift-giving were emphasized alongside practical considerations. Gifts were often wrapped in meaningful materials, presented with ritualistic speech, or accompanied by songs, poetry, or prayers. The presentation itself was as important as the object, underscoring values such as respect, thoughtfulness, and communal cohesion. This performative dimension of giving helped codify social norms, teaching recipients and observers alike about generosity, reciprocity, and ethical comportment. The Renaissance brought further refinement and elaboration to gift-giving practices. With the rise of literacy, art, and literature, gifts began to carry not only practical but also intellectual or symbolic significance. Books, illuminated manuscripts, and works of art became popular among the nobility, while even common folk valued items that conveyed thoughtfulness and cultural engagement. Written messages accompanying gifts, from personal letters to poetic verses, reinforced the moral and social dimensions of giving, emphasizing care, reflection, and intentionality. The early modern period in Europe saw gift-giving increasingly associated with specific calendar events, most prominently Christmas and New Year's. Customs varied by region. In some areas, gifts were exchanged on St. Nicholas's feast day, while in others, presents were reserved for Christmas Eve or Christmas Day.
Regardless of timing, the underlying principles of moral intent, social connection, and communal reinforcement remained constant. The objects themselves evolved, reflecting technological advancements, trade networks, and the material culture of the time, but the symbolic framework of generosity, care, and social cohesion endured. As European settlers carried these traditions to the Americas, they adapted to new social, economic, and cultural contexts. Colonial families observed Christmas with modest gift-giving, emphasizing practical items such as clothing, food, and tools. Over time, imported customs, local innovation, and exposure to broader cultural influences gradually shaped the forms of gift-giving, blending old and new practices in ways that reflected the unique social fabric of colonial and early modern America. By the 18th and 19th centuries, literature, print culture, and artistic depictions played a pivotal role in codifying the imagery and expectations surrounding gift-giving. Poems such as Clement Clarke Moore's A Visit from St. Nicholas and illustrated magazines depicting the holiday season helped standardize the narrative of a benevolent, gift-bringing figure arriving at night to deliver presents to children. These cultural artifacts reinforced timing, ritual, and expectation, gradually shaping a collective understanding of how, when, and why gifts were exchanged during the Christmas season. Commercialization of gift-giving began in earnest during the 19th century, particularly with the rise of department stores, mass-produced toys, and printed advertisements. While this period introduced new dynamics, emphasizing acquisition, display, and consumer culture, the underlying moral and social functions of giving persisted. Thoughtfulness, symbolic meaning, and the reinforcement of relationships remained central, even as the objects and scale of giving expanded. Gift-giving thus maintained continuity with earlier centuries while adapting to evolving economic and cultural realities. Gift-giving also reflects broader societal attitudes towards children, family, and community. In earlier periods, children were often peripheral participants in social rituals. By the 19th century, their inclusion in gift-giving and celebration became central. The modern emphasis on nurturing, rewarding, and delighting children can be traced back to the integration of literary, religious, and cultural influences, which collectively elevated childhood as a socially and morally significant stage of life. Gifts became a means of teaching virtue, inspiring joy, and strengthening intergenerational bonds. Despite changes in object, scale, and economic context, the essence of gift-giving as a moral, social, and symbolic practice has endured. It remains an expression of generosity, care, and relational connection, linking individual action to communal and spiritual values. The evolution of gift-giving demonstrates how cultural practices adapt over time, integrating historical, religious, social, and economic influences while preserving core human impulses to connect, to give, and to celebrate the bonds that sustain community.
Feasting traditions and seasonal foods. One of the most tangible and sensory-rich aspects of Christmas in both historical and modern contexts is the tradition of feasting. Food has always been central to communal gatherings, religious observance, and social celebration, and the seasonal feasts of Christmas are no exception. In medieval and early modern Europe, feasting during the winter months was shaped by a complex interplay of agriculture, climate, religious ritual, and social hierarchy, creating a tapestry of culinary practices that reflected both practical necessity and symbolic meaning. During the medieval period, winter posed significant challenges for communities reliant on agriculture. The harvest had long been completed, and fresh produce was scarce. As a result, feasts at Christmas were occasions for both indulgence and sustenance, featuring preserved meats, dried fruits, grains, and other foods that had been carefully stored throughout the year. The choice and preparation of these foods reflected both practicality and social symbolism. The wealth and status of a household could be demonstrated through the quality, quantity, and diversity of the feast, while shared consumption reinforced communal bonds and reciprocity. Among the nobility and wealthy urban families, Feasts were elaborate affairs, meticulously planned and executed. Multiple courses might include roasted meats such as boar, venison, and poultry, complemented by pies, pastries, and spiced dishes designed to delight the senses. Dishes were often prepared using exotic spices imported via long-distance trade, such as cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, which signified not only wealth, but also cosmopolitan awareness and cultural sophistication. Presentation mattered as much as taste. Tables were arranged to impress, with elaborate centerpieces, decorative platters, and symbolic garnishes, turning the feast into a spectacle that reflected both cultural refinement and social hierarchy. For commoners and rural families, feasts were simpler, but no less meaningful. Local game, preserved meats, grains, and seasonal vegetables formed the core of the meal, supplemented by bread, cheese, and ale. While the ingredients might have been humble, the act of feasting was imbued with ritual and communal significance. Families gathered around the hearth to share food, exchange stories, and participate in seasonal songs and games. These gatherings were moments of respite from daily labor, providing warmth, nourishment, and a sense of continuity and connection. Certain dishes and foods acquired symbolic meaning over time. Mince pies, originally made with meat, fruit, and spices, reflected both abundance and the blending of culinary and cultural traditions. Puddings, often enriched with dried fruits and nuts, were associated with prosperity and communal sharing. The Yule boar, roasted and served ceremonially, recalled pre-Christian solstice traditions while simultaneously adapting to Christian symbolic frameworks. These culinary choices were not arbitrary. They were deeply entwined with seasonal rhythms, agricultural cycles, and the cultural imagination of the communities that prepared and consumed them. Religious observance was closely linked to feasting. In Christian households, the preparation and consumption of food during the 12 days of Christmas mirrored liturgical rhythms and moral frameworks. Certain days called for fasting, abstinence, or specific observances, while others permitted indulgence and celebration. The careful alignment of dietary practice with religious calendar reinforced ethical and spiritual norms, teaching participants to balance restraint and celebration while participating in communal and sacred life. In urban centers, guilds and civic authorities also contributed to the organization of public feasts. Town halls, guild halls, and market squares were often sites of communal consumption where citizens could participate in shared meals during festival periods. These events reinforced social cohesion, provided opportunities for display of civic pride, and allowed communities to participate collectively in the seasonal rhythms of celebration. They also served as mechanisms for the dissemination of culinary knowledge, encouraging the adoption of popular recipes, techniques, and traditions across neighborhoods and regions. The introduction of new ingredients through trade and exploration gradually enriched Christmas culinary practices. Spices, sugar, dried fruits, and exotic nuts transformed the taste, texture, and symbolic meaning of festive dishes. Sugar, once an expensive luxury, allowed for the creation of confections that delighted children and adults alike, and it contributed to the association of Christmas with sweetness, indulgence, and celebratory abundance. These innovations reflected not only economic and trade dynamics, but also the cultural imagination, shaping expectations of taste, presentation, and ritual significance. Music, storytelling, and performance often accompanied feasting, creating a multi-sensory celebration in which food, sound, and narrative were intertwined. Carols, festive chants, and tales of saints and legends provided structure, entertainment, and moral instruction during meals. This integration of culinary and performative elements illustrates the holistic nature of Christmas observance,
where each sensory and symbolic dimension reinforced communal experience and cultural continuity. Children's involvement in feasts was both educational and celebratory. They participated in simple food preparation, learned recipes and traditions, and engaged in seasonal games. This inclusion ensured the intergenerational transmission of culinary knowledge and ritual practice. Moreover, by participating in feasting and related activities, children internalize values of hospitality, generosity, and gratitude, reinforcing the moral and social dimensions of the season. The evolution of feasting traditions over centuries reflects broader societal changes. In the Renaissance, the introduction of sophisticated culinary techniques, expanded ingredient availability, and enhanced knowledge of preservation and cooking allowed for increasingly elaborate and varied feasts. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the influence of courtly etiquette in domestic manuals standardized preparation, presentation, and consumption practices, linking culinary skill to social identity and moral propriety. By the 19th century, Christmas feasts had become emblematic of both family life and national identity in many parts of Europe and America. Roast meats, puddings, mince pies, and seasonal fruits became standardized symbols of the holiday, while the act of gathering around a table reinforced notions of familial unity, moral instruction, and shared joy. The commercialization of certain ingredients and dishes also began during this period, as specialized confections, spices, and preserves became widely available, allowing even middle-class households to emulate practices once reserved for the wealthy. Even today, the sensory and symbolic richness of Christmas feasting continues to resonate. While contemporary meals may feature modern recipes, international ingredients, and diverse culinary influences, the fundamental principles remain. Sharing abundance, reinforcing social bonds, celebrating seasonal rhythms, and connecting to historical and cultural memory. Each dish tells a story, carries symbolic weight, and participates in a chain of tradition that extends across centuries. Feasting traditions therefore provide more than mere nourishment or pleasure. They are deeply intertwined with religious observance, social cohesion, economic practices, and cultural identity. The careful selection, preparation, and sharing of food creates a ritualized space where the past, present, and future converge, where families and communities engage in acts of continuity, adaptation, and celebration. Seasonal foods are simultaneously practical and symbolic, reflecting the natural cycles of the year while expressing values of generosity, gratitude, and collective joy. In tracing the history of Christmas feasts, one observes the dynamic interplay between necessity, culture, and imagination. What began as simple provisions to sustain life through winter gradually evolved into elaborate, meaningful rituals that combined taste, presentation, performance, and moral instruction. The table became a focal point of cultural expression, moral teaching, and communal identity, demonstrating how ordinary acts, preparing and sharing food, can acquire extraordinary significance over time.
Caroling, pageants, and public revelries. The vibrant public celebrations of Christmas in medieval and early modern Europe were characterized not only by domestic feasts and private rituals, but also by communal displays of music, drama, and performance. Caroling, pageants, and public revelries provided opportunities for social cohesion, artistic expression, and cultural transmission. These events were highly structured, deeply symbolic, and participatory, reflecting a society in which communal engagement, moral instruction, and seasonal celebration were intertwined. Caroling, in particular, served as both entertainment and a vehicle for storytelling. Groups of singers, often accompanied by simple instruments such as flutes, fiddles, or percussion,
would move through villages and towns performing songs that blended religious narrative with local lore and seasonal motifs. Early carols were not exclusively about the nativity. They encompassed a variety of themes, including the natural world, moral lessons, and communal values. Participation was often open to all members of the community, encouraging inclusion and shared experience. The act of singing collectively fostered a sense of belonging and continuity, linking individuals to both their immediate neighbors and a broader cultural tradition. Pageants were another prominent feature of public celebration. These theatrical performances, often staged in town squares, churchyards, or guild halls, depicted biblical stories, historical events, or allegorical narratives. The passion plays, nativity scenes, and morality pageants combined entertainment with moral and religious instruction, making abstract ethical concepts tangible through performance. Pageants often involved elaborate costumes, props, and choreography, and participants from across social classes collaborated to bring the story to life. In doing so, communities reinforced shared beliefs, cultural memory, and social cohesion. Public revelries complemented caroling and pageantry, providing spaces for communal joy, role reversal, and festive indulgence. These celebrations drew upon pre-Christian winter traditions in which social hierarchies were temporarily relaxed. The Lord of Misrule or similar figures would preside over festivities, overseeing playful chaos, jesting, and mock ceremonies. Such inversions of social norms allowed communities to release tension, express creativity, and reaffirm the bonds that maintained social order throughout the rest of the year. Even in structured religious communities, moments of sanctioned revelry provided a necessary balance between solemn observance and human enjoyment. Music, performance, and revelry were closely interlinked. Processional songs often accompanied pageants, guiding audiences from scene to scene while reinforcing narrative and symbolic motifs. Bells, drums, and horns punctuated public gatherings, signaling transitions, celebrations, or the arrival of performers. Audiences themselves became participants, clapping, singing, or interacting with the performance in ways that blurred the line between observer and performer. This participatory dynamic reinforced communal identity and ensured that the celebrations were felt collectively rather than simply observed passively. The civic and religious authorities often played a dual role in shaping public celebrations. Churches and local magistrates sought to maintain moral oversight while supporting communal engagement. Regulations might govern the timing, content, or scope of performances, ensuring that they aligned with social and religious norms. Yet, within these boundaries, performers and participants exercise considerable creative freedom, allowing for innovation, local color, and responsiveness to current events or social issues. This balance between regulation and creativity helped sustain the vitality and relevance of public celebrations over time. The materials and craftsmanship involved in pageants and public displays were themselves reflections of social and economic structures. Guilds, often responsible for organizing and funding performances, contributed labor, materials, and expertise. Costumes, props, and stage designs demonstrated both technical skill and aesthetic sensibility, turning civic spaces into sites of cultural production. These investments signaled prestige and communal pride, linking the visual and performative aspects of celebration with broader societal values and local identity. Seasonal timing was essential. Public celebrations were often aligned with the liturgical calendar, marking key moments such as the Feast of the Nativity, the 12 Days of Christmas, or Epiphany. Synchronizing performances with these dates reinforced both religious observance and seasonal rhythm, creating a shared temporal structure that anchored communal life. This temporal alignment also ensured that participants' experiences were coherent, memorable, and connected to broader spiritual and social frameworks. Children and youth played vital roles in public festivities. In addition to attending performances, they often participated in choirs, processions, and minor theatrical roles. This inclusion served educational, social, and cultural purposes. Young participants learned performance skills, memorized narratives, and internalized moral and religious lessons. Their involvement ensured the intergenerational transmission of cultural knowledge, reinforcing continuity while adapting traditions to contemporary circumstances. Regional variation contributed to the richness and diversity of public celebrations. In Northern Europe, pageants emphasized elaborate nativity scenes and choral performances, while in southern regions, processions and outdoor enactments of local legends were more common. Music, instruments, and costumes reflected local resources, climate, and cultural influences. Despite these differences, the underlying principles, communal participation, moral instruction, and festive festivity remained remarkably consistent, illustrating the adaptability of the tradition across geographic and social contexts. The integration of visual and auditory elements enhanced the immersive quality of public celebrations. Costumes, masks, banners, and decorative elements created a striking visual tableau, while music and chants provided rhythm, emphasis, and emotional resonance. The combination of these sensory inputs allowed audiences to experience the season in a holistic way, engaging both intellect and emotion, sense and spirit. This multimodal approach made celebrations memorable, meaningful, and culturally significant. In many cases, public celebrations also provided opportunities for negotiation of social relationships. Feasting, gift exchanges, and ceremonial recognition of civic or religious figures reinforced hierarchies, while playful inversion and satire allowed communities to reflect critically on authority. This dual function, celebratory and regulatory, illustrates the complexity of early Christmas public observances, which balanced enjoyment, education, and social cohesion in nuanced ways. The role of narrative in pageants and revelries was central. Biblical stories, hagiographies, and local legends were dramatized, often with creative interpretation and improvisation. This made abstract concepts tangible, moral lessons memorable, and cultural memory vivid. Storytelling through performance allowed communities to negotiate their values, beliefs, and historical consciousness, ensuring that each generation absorbed both tradition and interpretation in ways that were relevant to their lived experience. Even in modest communities adapted these forms to their circumstances. Small villages might stage simple performances with local talent and handmade props, while larger towns could support more elaborate spectacles. Regardless of scale, the principles of communal engagement, moral reinforcement, and festive enjoyment persisted, demonstrating the universality and adaptability of these practices. The continuity of caroling, pageants, and public revelries into later centuries highlights the enduring appeal of communal performance as a vehicle for cultural expression. While the specific forms and content evolved, reflecting changes in literacy, technology, and social organization, the underlying functions remained to celebrate, instruct, and unify. Public engagement in these traditions forged collective identity, reinforced seasonal rhythms, and created shared memories that transcended individual experience.
Puritan resistance to Christmas in early America. While Christmas in Europe was gradually developing a rich tapestry of feasts, carols, pageants, and domestic traditions, the New World witnessed a markedly different trajectory in certain regions. Among Puritan settlers in early America, the celebration of Christmas was viewed with suspicion and, in many cases, outright hostility. Their opposition stemmed not merely from a desire for austerity, but from a deeply held theological and social conviction that the holiday, as it was observed in Europe, was tainted by pagan excess, moral laxity, and ritualistic embellishment that distracted from true Christian devotion. The Puritan critique was grounded in several interrelated concerns. First, they were deeply wary of any observances that had roots in pre-Christian or non-biblical traditions. Yule celebrations, Saturnalia, and other winter festivals, despite their Christianized adaptations, were perceived as morally suspect remnants of pagan ritual. To Puritans, adopting these customs was not only frivolous, but spiritually dangerous, potentially leading the faithful away from a disciplined, scripture-centered life. Celebrations that included singing, dancing, elaborate feasting, or gift exchanges were particularly condemned because they were associated with indulgence, idleness, and moral distraction. Second, Puritans were concerned about the social and communal implications of holiday celebrations. European-style festivities often included rowdy public gatherings, theatrical performances, and moments of temporary role reversal, which in the eyes of Puritan leaders could encourage disorder, drunkenness, and social subversion. Authorities in Puritan settlements feared that such behavior undermined communal discipline and moral order, which were central to the survival and coherence of their fledgling societies. Public revelries, particularly in urban centers, were perceived as a threat to the carefully maintained hierarchy and ethical norms that structured Puritan life. In early 17th century Massachusetts, these theological and social concerns were codified into law. Celebrations of Christmas were prohibited, and those who observed the day in defiance of edicts could face fines or public censure. Colonial records indicate that magistrates closely monitored holiday behavior, issuing warnings and penalties to ensure compliance. This legal suppression was not merely symbolic, it reflected a comprehensive attempt to enforce a vision of communal life in which religious purity, moral discipline, and social order were paramount. The Puritan approach to Christmas also illustrates the intersection of religion, culture, and identity. By rejecting traditional European practices, Puritans asserted a distinctively American religious identity, one rooted in austerity, scriptural fidelity, and moral vigilance. Their resistance was a form of cultural differentiation, signaling to themselves and others that they sought to create a society guided by principle rather than custom, by divine mandate rather than inherited tradition. In this sense, Puritan opposition to Christmas was as much a statement about communal identity and ideological coherence as it was a critique of holiday practices. Despite official prohibitions, resistance was met with variation at the local level. In some communities, individuals and families quietly maintained personal or domestic observances, adapting elements of European tradition in ways that minimized public visibility. Simple meals, small gift exchanges, and private devotional readings were sometimes permitted, reflecting a nuanced negotiation between ideological principle and human desire for festivity. These subtle adaptations demonstrate that even within highly regulated communities, cultural practices persisted in modified forms, revealing the resilience of tradition in the face of official opposition. The Puritan critique extended beyond the timing and content of Christmas celebrations. They were deeply concerned with the moral messages conveyed by European customs. Gift-giving, for example, was criticized when it became an occasion for excess, indulgence, or ostentation. Decorative practices, such as the use of evergreens, candles, and ornamental displays, were viewed as distracting, frivolous, or spiritually meaningless. Even music and caroling, so central to European observance, were often condemned as secular, potentially licentious, and incompatible with disciplined religious life.
In this way, opposition to Christmas encompassed not merely external ritual, but also the values, symbolism, and emotional engagement associated with the holiday. Educational institutions and religious authorities played a critical role in reinforcing these prohibitions. Sermons, catechism, and moral instruction emphasized the spiritual dangers of holiday indulgence, highlighting the virtues of sobriety, discipline, and scriptural fidelity. Clergy reminded congregations that the true celebration of Christ's birth should be rooted in prayer, reflection, and the pursuit of piety rather than in material or social spectacle. These teachings shaped communal norms, social expectations, and individual behavior, illustrating the power of religious authority to regulate cultural practice. Interestingly, the Puritan resistance to Christmas was not universal in early America. Settlers of other backgrounds, Anglicans, Lutherans, Catholics, and Dutch Reformed communities continued to observe the holiday in ways closely aligned with European customs. This created a patchwork of observance across the colonies, in which regional, religious, and cultural variation influenced the degree to which Christmas was celebrated. In cities with diverse populations, public displays, gift exchanges, and feasting persisted despite puritanical influence, demonstrating the tension between ideological regulation and human desire for festivity. Over time, Puritan resistance waned in the face of demographic, cultural, and economic pressures. The arrival of immigrants with different traditions, the spread of commercial networks, and the gradual relaxation of rigid religious codes facilitated the reintegration of Christmas into public and domestic life. By the 18th and 19th centuries, what had once been a suppressed or frowned upon holiday became a central feature of American cultural life, though the traces of Puritan influence remained visible in the emphasis on family, domesticity, and moral reflection. The Puritan experience highlights the complex dynamics of tradition, adaptation, and cultural negotiation. Resistance to Christmas illustrates how deeply embedded rituals can be contested, reinterpreted, and suppressed, while also showing the persistence of cultural practices even under conditions of regulation. This tension between authority and tradition, austerity and festivity, regulation and innovation is a recurring theme in the broader history of Christmas and provides insight into how the holiday has been shaped by both ideological and social forces. Moreover, the Puritan story reminds us that the history of Christmas is not linear or uniform. Rather than a smooth progression from pagan ritual to Christian celebration to modern festivity, the holiday has been subject to oscillation, contestation, and regional variation. Observance is shaped by theology, economy, climate, social structure, and individual desire, all of which interact to produce complex patterns of continuity and change. The Puritan experience is a vivid example of how cultural practice is negotiated, contested, and ultimately transformed across time and space. Even in the context of suppression, the human impulse towards celebration, communal gathering, and ritual expression persisted. Families, neighborhoods, and communities found ways to mark the season in private or subdued ways, preserving continuity with broader cultural memory while adapting to local constraints. These adaptations laid the groundwork for the eventual resurgence of Christmas in North America, demonstrating the resilience of tradition and the capacity of cultural practices to endure, transform, and integrate new contexts.
Colonial adaptations and regional variations. As European settlers established communities across the American colonies, Christmas traditions underwent a remarkable process of adaptation, shaped by geography, climate, religious affiliation, and available resources. While rooted in familiar European customs, these practices transformed in response to the practical realities of colonial life, resulting in regional variations that reflected both necessity and creativity. Examining these adaptations reveals the dynamic interplay between inherited cultural frameworks and the new social, environmental, and economic contexts of early America. In the northern colonies, where Puritan influence had initially suppressed public celebration, settlers often observed Christmas with modest domestic rituals. Despite official disapproval, families incorporated small-scale feasts, prayers, and symbolic decorations into their homes. Evergreens, for example, were sometimes used discreetly, hung in doorways or near hearths as symbols of life and renewal during the long winter months. Small gifts, practical items such as clothing or tools, were exchanged quietly among family members, allowing the essence of the holiday to persist without attracting public scrutiny. These subtle practices illustrate the persistence of cultural memory even under restrictive conditions. Southern colonies, by contrast, demonstrated more overt and festive observance. Anglican, Catholic, and Dutch Reformed settlers maintained public celebrations that closely resembled European traditions. Church services, communal feasts, and processions were common, and the milder climate facilitated outdoor activities. Decorations included greenery, fruits, and candles, and feasts often featured locally sourced ingredients, such as game, fish, and seasonal vegetables. In these regions, Christmas became a central social occasion, blending religious observance with communal entertainment and providing opportunities for social networking, display of status, and reinforcement of communal cohesion. Regional variations also emerged in the realm of gift giving. In the northern colonies, practicality dictated the nature of presents. Useful items that could support household labor or children's education were prioritized. In southern colonies, wealthier families were able to exchange more elaborate gifts, including imported goods, clothing, or small luxury items. These differences reflected both economic realities and cultural attitudes toward display, indulgence, and social signaling, illustrating how geography and local conditions shaped the material culture of celebration. Culinary practices further highlight regional adaptation. In New England, where preserved meats, root vegetables, and hardtack were staples, Christmas meals emphasized practicality and sustenance, with modest additions of dried fruits or simple baked goods to mark the occasion. In southern colonies, incorporated fresh seafood, game, fruits, and spices, creating more varied and elaborate spreads. The availability of sugar, imported from the Caribbean, allowed for the preparation of sweet confections, puddings, and pastries, signaling both affluence and cultural continuity with European customs. These culinary distinctions reinforced regional identity and reflected the interconnection between environment, economy, and cultural practice. Music and public performance also adapted to local circumstances. In areas with dense populations and established urban centers, communal caroling and pageantry could be organized with relative ease. Choirs, instrumental ensembles, and civic pageants brought communities together and reinforced collective cultural memory. In more rural or sparsely populated areas, performances were scaled to fit local resources, with small groups performing traditional songs or staging simple plays in homes or communal gathering spaces. These adaptations demonstrate the resilience and flexibility of cultural traditions, allowing communities to maintain festive observance despite structural constraints. Religious diversity within the colonies also shaped regional practices. While Puritan communities emphasized austerity, Anglicans celebrated with a focus on liturgical observance, and Catholics integrated sacramental rites, communal meals, and devotional readings. Dutch and German immigrants introduced distinctive customs such as the Christmas tree, the Feast of St. Nicholas, and traditional songs and games. The coexistence of these varied practices created a mosaic of celebration in which local culture, religious identity, and European heritage interacted in complex and meaningful ways. The role of communal institutions,
particularly churches and civic authorities, was significant in shaping regional expression. In some areas, religious leaders encouraged moderate celebration, emphasizing moral instruction and scriptural reflection alongside festivity. Civic readers sometimes sponsored public feasts, parades, or charitable distributions, linking religious observance with civic responsibility. These interventions helped codify practice, establish public norms, and create shared experiences that reinforced communal cohesion and cultural identity. Climate and environment further influenced adaptation. In northern regions with harsh winters, outdoor celebrations were limited, and domestic observances emphasized warmth, light, and comfort. Hearth-centered activities such as storytelling, candle lighting, and indoor games became central. In milder southern climates, outdoor activities, processions, and communal gatherings were feasible, allowing for more public expression of festivity. The interaction between environmental conditions and cultural practice highlights the practical dimension of tradition. Celebration was both meaningful and constrained by the realities of place. Trade and economic networks also shaped regional variation. Access to imported goods, spices, and luxuries enabled more elaborate feasts and decorations in port cities and affluent towns, while inland or isolated communities relied on local resources and ingenuity. Handmade ornaments, locally sourced greenery, and self-produced confections became markers of both creativity and adaptation, illustrating the integration of economic circumstance into the cultural expression of Christmas. Education and intergenerational transmission played a critical role in sustaining regional traditions. Children learned songs, recipes, games, and rituals from parents, extended family, and community members. This process ensured continuity even when external pressures, religious suppression, economic hardship, or geographic isolation limited the visibility of celebration. In this way, knowledge, values, and skills associated with Christmas were preserved, adapted, and passed down, allowing the holiday to survive and flourish across generations and regions. The interplay of European heritage and colonial innovation is particularly evident in decorative practices. While traditional greenery, candles, and symbolic ornaments were maintained, local adaptation introduced new elements: indigenous plants, handcrafted items, and materials reflecting local ecology. Decorative choices became expressions of both cultural memory and regional identity, illustrating the capacity of tradition to absorb and integrate new influences while preserving symbolic continuity. Social interaction was a central aspect of regional variation. In northern settlements, small-scale communal visits, shared readings, and modest exchange of gifts fostered intimate, family-centered celebrations. In southern towns, large gatherings, public performances, and civic-sponsored feasts emphasized social display and broader communal engagement. These differences reveal how demographic, social, and environmental factors shape the scale, scope, and style of celebration, creating a rich tapestry of regional expression within the broader framework of Christmas observance. Religious observance and festive innovation were not mutually exclusive. Communities found ways to balance theological commitment with the human desire for festivity. Scriptural readings, prayers, and sermons were integrated with feasting, music, and domestic ritual, ensuring that celebration remained morally and spiritually consonant with communal values. This blending of devotion and festivity reflects the adaptive capacity of tradition, demonstrating that even in new environments, cultural practices could be reshaped to meet both spiritual and social needs. Colonial adaptation also extended to the calendar of observance. While European holidays often had precise liturgical or civic dates, American communities sometimes adjusted timing to suit local conditions, labor demands, and climate. This flexibility allowed communities to maintain.
Migration and demographic change further enriched regional variation. Immigrant communities introduced distinct customs, including specific foods, songs, games, and rituals, which blended with existing practices. Intermarriage and neighborhood interaction facilitated cross-cultural exchange, resulting in hybrid forms of celebration that combined elements from multiple traditions. This process illustrates the dynamic, evolving nature of Christmas, which thrives through adaptation, negotiation, and integration. By examining colonial adaptations and regional variations, we see how Christmas evolved as both a resilient and flexible tradition. While the European foundation provided structure and symbolic meaning, local circumstances, religious identity, economic realities, and social networks shaped the concrete expression of celebration. The result was a rich mosaic of practice, reflecting the diversity, creativity, and continuity of human cultural life. The Christmas tree comes to America. Among the many enduring symbols of Christmas, the Christmas tree stands out as both visually striking and deeply resonant in cultural imagination. Its presence in American homes today may seem ordinary, but the arrival and adoption of this tradition in the United States was a complex process shaped by migration, cultural exchange, religious negotiation, and social aspiration. Understanding how the Christmas tree became an emblem of festive observance provides insight into the ways traditions are transplanted, adapted, and normalized in new social and geographical contexts. The Christmas tree tradition itself originated in German-speaking regions of Europe. Evergreen trees had long been associated with Winter Solstice rituals, symbolizing life, renewal, and protection during the darkest time of the year. By the 16th century, devout Christians in Germany were decorating small trees with apples, nuts, and later candles to celebrate the Nativity. This practice combined symbolic resonance with domestic ritual. The tree became a focal point around which families could gather, celebrate, and reflect on spiritual themes. German immigrants were the primary agents of introducing the Christmas tree to America. Settling primarily in Pennsylvania and parts of the Midwest, these communities maintained their cultural heritage, including the use of decorated evergreens during the holiday season. Initially, this practice was confined to immigrant enclaves and did not immediately permeate broader American society. Outside these communities, Christmas was observed without trees, reflecting both puritanical influences and the absence of the European domestic ritual in other cultural milieus. The 19th century marked a turning point. Increasing contact between German Americans and the broader population, combined with the rise of print media and illustrated periodicals, facilitated the diffusion of the Christmas tree tradition. Articles, engravings, and later photographs depicted elaborately decorated trees in domestic settings, emphasizing both aesthetic appeal and the moral and familial virtues associated with the ritual. The tree became a visual shorthand for festive domesticity, signaling warmth, togetherness, and cultural sophistication. One influential moment in popularizing the Christmas tree was the depiction of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in English print media during the mid-19th century. Prince Albert, of German descent, introduced the decorated tree to the royal household, and illustrations of the royal family gathered around the tree reached American readers through newspapers and magazines. These images helped normalize the Christmas tree in middle and upper-class American homes, lending social legitimacy and aspirational appeal to what had previously been an immigrant-specific custom. The evolution of Christmas tree decoration also reflected both local adaptation and technological innovation. Early trees in America were adorned with apples, nuts, and candles, following European models. Over time, decorations diversified. Handmade ornaments, colored paper chains, ribbons, and later glass ornaments imported from Germany added aesthetic richness. Candles gave way to gas and eventually electric lights, enhancing both safety and visual spectacle.
This process illustrates how imported traditions are continuously transformed through creativity, technological advancement, and cultural integration. Religious negotiation played a subtle but important role in the adoption of the Christmas tree. While some Protestant groups initially viewed the tree as a pagan relic, over time it was reinterpreted as a symbol compatible with Christian teaching. The evergreen represented eternal life through Christ, and the act of decorating the tree became an occasion for family gathering, reflection, and moral instruction. Clergy in various denominations gradually incorporated the tree into sermons, Sunday school lessons, and community observances, framing it as both culturally enriching and spiritually edifying. The social dynamics of Christmas tree adoption reveal broader patterns in American cultural life. Initially concentrated in urban centers and affluent households, trees gradually appeared in rural homes and working-class neighborhoods. Local artisans, merchants, and craftsmen responded to demand, producing ornaments, tree stands, and decorative items, thus linking the tradition to emerging commercial networks. Department stores began to display trees and ornaments, providing both inspiration and practical access, and reinforcing the tree's role as a central emblem of seasonal celebration. Children played a critical role in the popularization of the Christmas tree. Stories, illustrations, and later advertisements emphasized the delight and wonder that trees evoked in young observers. The tree became a site of imaginative engagement. Children hung ornaments, arranged candles or lights, and awaited gifts placed under its branches. This participatory dimension reinforced the moral and social value of the tree, linking individual experience to family cohesion and broader communal expectations. The tree's symbolism extended beyond the domestic sphere. In public spaces, civic buildings, town squares, and later commercial establishments displayed large, decorated trees, signaling the presence of the holiday and inviting communal engagement. These public trees mirrored domestic practice while reinforcing social cohesion, visual continuity, and cultural aspiration. The interplay between private and public expression illustrates how the Christmas tree functioned as both a personal and collective symbol, bridging home life and communal identity. Regional adaptation continued to influence how the Christmas tree was celebrated. In northern states, evergreen species such as fir and spruce were preferred, reflecting local ecology and availability. In southern states, different species were employed, sometimes supplemented with imported greenery or artificial alternatives. Decorations were also shaped by regional materials, craft traditions, and aesthetic preferences, reflecting a dynamic interaction between imported custom and local creativity. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the Christmas tree had achieved widespread acceptance across American society. Its association with family, childhood, domesticity, and moral instruction made it an emblem of culturally normative celebration. Print media, commercial promotion, and social networks reinforced its centrality, while technological developments in lighting and ornamentation enhanced its visual appeal. This integration illustrates how an imported tradition can be naturalized, transformed, and elevated to national cultural significance through a combination of social, economic, and technological processes. Even in contemporary times, the Christmas tree remains both a symbol and a practice, connecting individuals to history, family, and community. It serves as a focal point for ritualized gatherings, storytelling, and festive display. While ornaments, lights, and tree varieties have diversified, the underlying cultural functions, providing visual delight, fostering communal engagement, and marking the seasonal rhythm, remain remarkably consistent. In this way, the Christmas tree exemplifies the resilience, adaptability, and symbolic richness of cultural tradition.
Santa Claus and the 19th century, a cultural icon emerges. Among the most enduring symbols of Christmas in America, Santa Claus occupies a singular place. While his roots can be traced to historical figures, European folklore, and religious observance, the figure of Santa Claus as a cultural icon was largely shaped and solidified during the 19th century. This period witnessed a remarkable transformation in which a folkloric, religiously inspired figure became a national emblem of festive celebration, moral instruction, and commercial imagination. Understanding the emergence of Santa Claus during this era illuminates the complex processes through which cultural symbols evolve, adapt, and gain widespread resonance. The historical antecedents of Santa Claus are numerous. Saint Nicholas, the 4th century Bishop of Myra, was renowned for his acts of generosity, particularly toward children and the poor. European traditions preserved and transformed his memory, giving rise to local customs in the Netherlands, Germany, and Scandinavia. By the early modern period, figures such as Sinterklaas in the Netherlands embodied both religious reference and folkloric imagination, blending miracle stories, gift-giving, and ritualized celebration. Dutch immigrants carried these traditions to the American colonies, particularly in New York, where they merged with local practices and gradually evolved into a distinct figure. The 19th century provided fertile ground for the transformation of Santa Claus from regional folklore into a nationally recognized cultural icon. This period was marked by rapid social change. Urbanization, industrialization, the rise of print media, and the expansion of transportation networks facilitated the dissemination of ideas, images, and narratives. Newspapers, magazines, and books provided platforms for the codification and circulation of Santa Claus stories, allowing a figure once localized and variable to become standardized and widely familiar. Clement Clarke Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, commonly known by its opening line, "'Twas the night before Christmas," was instrumental in shaping the modern image of Santa Claus. Moore's portrayal emphasized characteristics that endure today. A jolly, rotund figure traveling in a sleigh pulled by reindeer, delivering gifts to children on Christmas Eve. This literary depiction provided visual and narrative coherence, offering artists, illustrators, and storytellers a template for representation. The poem also reinforced moral themes, presenting Santa as a benevolent figure who rewarded good behavior, thereby intertwining festive enjoyment with ethical instruction. Illustration and visual culture played a critical role in the emergence of Santa Claus as a cultural icon. In the 1860s and 1870s, artists such as Thomas Nast contributed to the standardization and popularization of Santa's appearance. Nast's illustrations, published in magazines such as Harper's Weekly, depicted Santa with a white beard, fur-trimmed suit, and a joyful demeanor, often surrounded by symbols of domestic warmth, industry, and communal festivity. These images provided visual consistency and reinforced cultural recognition, embedding Santa Claus in the public imagination and linking him to ideals of generosity, family, and seasonal celebration. The evolution of Santa Claus also reflects the intersection of commercial enterprise and cultural practice. As the 19th century progressed, retailers and advertisers recognized the potential of Santa as a symbol to stimulate consumption, encourage gift-giving, and promote the emerging consumer culture surrounding Christmas. Department stores, print advertisements, and later illustrated catalogs incorporated Santa Claus into marketing strategies, using his image to evoke both nostalgia and aspiration. This commercialization did not diminish Santa's symbolic resonance. Rather, it amplified his visibility and embedded him in the fabric of American cultural life. Children's engagement with Santa Claus was central to his enduring appeal. Letters to Santa, anticipation of gifts, and imaginative play around his figure provided both entertainment and moral instruction.
By associating rewards with good behavior, stories of Santa reinforced social norms and ethical expectations, making the holiday not merely a time of indulgence, but also a period for reflection, aspiration, and communal values. The figure of Santa thereby served as a bridge between play, imagination, and socialization, integrating moral and cultural education into the festive experience. Regional and cultural variation influenced how Santa Claus was understood and represented. In urban centers, depictions emphasized consumer-oriented imagery, elaborate displays, and public encounters, such as parades and department store appearances. In rural areas, oral storytelling, homemade gifts, and domestic rituals shaped Santa's presence in more intimate, family-centered contexts. Immigrant communities introduced additional elements, blending European customs with emerging American forms, further enriching the symbolic and narrative diversity of the figure. The integration of Santa Claus into American culture illustrates the broader processes of tradition adaptation, standardization, and cultural negotiation. While historical antecedents and European folklore provided the raw material, 19th century social, economic, and technological conditions allowed the figure to gain coherence, visibility, and symbolic power. Print culture, urbanization, and emerging commercial networks created the conditions for a localized tradition to transform into a national icon, recognized and celebrated across diverse regions, social classes, and ethnic communities. Santa Claus also functioned as a moral and social pedagogical tool. Stories emphasized the virtues of kindness, generosity, and industriousness, linking the magical and entertaining aspects of the figure to ethical lessons. The anticipation of Santa's visit encouraged children to consider their behavior and social obligations, blending imaginative engagement with moral instruction. In doing so, Santa became not merely a symbol of festive cheer, but a vehicle for cultural continuity, socialization, and ethical reflection. The visual and narrative codification of Santa Claus continued to evolve. Illustrators introduced variations, including depictions of Santa interacting with children, animals, and domestic spaces, reinforcing associations with family, community, and seasonal abundance. These representations emphasized warmth, accessibility, and joy, creating a character both magical and relatable, capable of resonating across age, geography, and social circumstance. By the late 19th century, Santa Claus had become inseparable from the American conception of Christmas. He functioned as a mediator between past and present, tradition and innovation, domesticity and public celebration. The figure encapsulated continuity with European antecedents while accommodating local cultural and social expectations. In this way, Santa Claus exemplifies the capacity of folklore and ritual to adapt, endure, and gain iconic status within new historical and cultural contexts. Even as the 20th century approached, the image and narrative of Santa Claus continued to evolve. Technological innovations in lighting, photography, and mass media allowed for increasingly vivid and widespread representation. Department stores employed Santa for public appearances, promotional photographs, and interactive experiences, while illustrated books and magazines circulated his image to an ever-expanding audience. These developments ensured that Santa Claus was firmly entrenched as a central figure in American festive culture, both domestically and publicly visible, bridging private ritual and collective celebration. The emergence of Santa Claus as a cultural icon highlights the interplay of imagination, media, commerce, and tradition. What began as the veneration of a historical figure, mediated through European folklore and domestic practice, became a standardized symbol recognized across a nation. His story illustrates the ways in which cultural symbols are created, disseminated, and normalized, revealing the dynamic relationship between history, myth, and everyday life. In this light, the 19th century transformation of Santa Claus is emblematic of the broader history of Christmas itself, a story of adaptation, negotiation, and synthesis. Folkloric roots,
Coca-Cola, media, and the modern Santa image. The transformation of Santa Claus from a folkloric figure to a universally recognized cultural icon continued into the 20th century, largely influenced by developments in mass media and commercial enterprise. Among the most significant factors shaping the modern image of Santa Claus was the collaboration between advertising campaigns, illustration, and the dissemination of visual culture through newspapers, magazines, and later broadcast media. The figure that millions of Americans, and later the world, came to associate with Christmas owes much to this period of commercial and visual innovation. While the basic contours of Santa's appearance, his rotund figure, red suit, white beard, and jolly demeanor had been established in the 19th century through the works of illustrators like Thomas Nast, the early 20th century brought a standardization and global visibility previously unattainable. Technological advances in print reproduction, photography, and color illustration allowed advertisers and illustrators to distribute images widely, ensuring a consistent and appealing depiction of Santa. One of the most influential commercial campaigns associated with Santa Claus was undertaken by the Coca-Cola Company beginning in the 1930s. Recognizing the potential of the festive season to boost sales and associate their brand with joy and family togetherness, Coca-Cola commissioned artist Haddon Sundblom to create images of Santa Claus for advertisements. Sundblom's illustrations portrayed Santa as a warm, approachable, and generous figure, a plump man in a red suit trimmed with white fur, smiling gently, interacting with children, holding a bottle of Coca-Cola, and radiating both mirth and kindness. These images were widely circulated in magazines, billboards, and print advertisements, reaching millions of consumers and establishing a visual standard that endures to this day. The influence of Coca-Cola's campaign cannot be overstated. Sundblom's Santa unified various regional and historical depictions into a single, cohesive, and emotionally resonant image. Where earlier illustrations varied in size, color, costume details, or demeanor, Sundblom's Santa combined all these elements with artistic sophistication and emotional appeal. The images were accessible and relatable, emphasizing warmth, familial intimacy, and communal celebration, thereby embedding the figure within everyday consciousness and reinforcing its association with both Christmas and general festive joy. Mass media played an equally crucial role in reinforcing and disseminating this standardized image. Newspapers, magazines, and catalogs regularly featured Santa in illustrations, advertisements, and serialized stories. Film and radio further amplified Santa's visibility, transforming him from a literary or illustrative figure to a dynamic cultural presence. Through repeated exposure across multiple media channels, Santa became a familiar, comforting, and recognizable symbol associated with moral goodness, generosity, and the warmth of domestic celebration. The convergence of commercial interests and cultural practice raises intriguing questions about the interplay between capitalism, ritual, and tradition. Coca-Cola's adoption and promotion of Santa Claus was not merely a marketing strategy, but a form of cultural shaping, aligning consumer behavior with symbolic representation. By associating Santa with their product, Coca-Cola linked the act of festive consumption with the emotional and cultural resonance of Christmas, reinforcing both brand identity and broader social norms surrounding celebration. Despite commercial influence, the modern Santa retained a strong narrative and ethical dimension.
Stories, advertisements, and media representations emphasize generosity, moral reflection, and the rewards of good behavior, echoing earlier 19th century formulations. The figure continued to serve as both a symbol of imaginative delight and a conduit for social instruction. Children's engagement with Santa through letters, anticipation of gifts, and interaction with public displays reinforced these functions, integrating entertainment, moral learning, and cultural continuity. Regional and social variation persisted even as the standardized image spread. While Sunblom Santa became iconic, households adapted the figure to local tastes, resources, and cultural sensibilities. Handmade ornaments, local depictions, and domestic rituals reflected a continued dialogue between mass-mediated imagery and individual and familial expression. In this way, the commercialized image of Santa coexisted with diverse local practices, creating a layered and multifaceted cultural phenomenon. The aesthetic sophistication of Sunblom's work also contributed to Santa's widespread appeal. Through attention to facial expression, posture, and gesture, Sunblom conveyed warmth, benevolence, and gentle humor. His Santa was approachable, relatable, and imbued with personality, bridging the gap between mythic figure and emotionally accessible presence. This humanization of a legendary character helped ensure enduring popularity, reinforcing the figure's role in domestic and public celebration alike. Cultural adaptation was further facilitated by international exposure. Images of Santa Claus in Coca-Cola advertising, as well as in magazines, books, and films, reached audiences beyond the United States. The recognizable red-suited, white-bearded figure began to influence European, Asian, and Latin American conceptions of Christmas, illustrating the capacity of visual culture to transcend national boundaries and integrate diverse populations into shared cultural imagery. Technological innovation extended beyond print media to include the development of animated representations, television specials, and eventually digital imagery. Each new medium offered opportunities to reinterpret, standardize, and amplify Santa's presence. Television programming featuring Santa in narrative contexts ranging from short cartoons to full-length specials reinforced established iconography while embedding the figure in popular culture, ensuring that successive generations would encounter a familiar, comforting, and morally coherent representation. Critics and historians have noted the complex interplay between commercialization and cultural continuity in this process. While Coca-Cola and mass media accelerated the dissemination and standardization of Santa Claus, the figure also retained deep symbolic resonance rooted in centuries of tradition. The red-suited, jolly Santa did not merely promote a product, he embodied cultural ideals, domestic warmth, ethical instruction, and intergenerational continuity. This dual role, both commercial and symbolic, illustrates the multifaceted nature of modern festive culture. Public engagement remained central to Santa's influence. Department stores, community events, and parades created spaces where children and families could interact with the figure in tangible, performative ways. Santa's presence in civic and commercial spaces reinforced communal and cultural cohesion, linking individual experience with broader social patterns. These public encounters ensured that the figure remained not only a media image, but also an embodied participant in the lived experience of Christmas. Even as the 20th century progressed, the modern Santa continued to evolve subtly. Variations in depiction, costume, and narrative detail reflected local and cultural adaptation, while innovations in media technology and marketing strategies expanded reach and visibility. Yet the essential elements, jolly demeanor, red and white costume, generosity, and association with gift-giving remained consistent, underscoring the durability and coherence of the cultural symbol. The story of Coca-Cola, media, and the modern Santa image thus exemplifies the ways in which tradition, commerce, and media interact to shape cultural practice. It demonstrates how a figure rooted in history and folklore can be adapted, standardized, and amplified through strategic dissemination and imaginative engagement. The result is a cultural icon that is simultaneously historical, imaginative, moral, and commercial, a figure capable of connecting past and present, individual and community, domestic ritual and mass culture. In sum, the 20th century development of Santa Claus highlights the interplay of multiple forces, artistic, commercial, technological, and social, in the evolution of cultural symbols. Coca-Cola's campaigns, mass media dissemination, and popular imagination combine to create an image of Santa that is recognizable, emotionally resonant, and symbolically rich. The figure continues to embody the joy, generosity, and communal connection that have been central to Christmas celebration for centuries, linking historical tradition with modern cultural practice.
Stockings, chimneys, and other domestic rituals. Alongside the figure of Santa Claus, the domestic rituals associated with Christmas, most notably hanging stockings, leaving treats for Santa, and the imaginative notion of descent through the chimney, became central elements of American holiday culture. These practices, which might now seem familiar and unremarkable, evolved over centuries, blending European folklore, family tradition, and localized adaptation to create intimate, meaningful, and enduring domestic customs. The origins of the Christmas stocking can be traced to European legends associated with St. Nicholas. One popular story recounts how Nicholas, wishing to provide dowries for 3 impoverished sisters, secretly delivered bags of gold by dropping them into stockings that had been hung to dry by the fireplace. This tale, among others, emphasized both generosity and secrecy, linking material gift-giving with moral instruction. Immigrant communities carried these stories to America, gradually transforming them into practical domestic rituals. In early American households, the hanging of stockings was a simple affair. Families used what was available. Socks, small bags, or pouches were affixed to mantles or placed near hearts, often filled with modest gifts such as fruits, nuts, coins, or handmade trinkets. The ritual was participatory and anticipatory. Children would prepare for Santa's arrival, engage in imaginative reflection about the moral significance of their behavior, and delight in the surprise element of discovering small treasures on Christmas morning. The emphasis was on creativity, intimacy, and moral education, rather than opulence or commercialism. The chimney, as the assumed entry point for Santa Claus, has its own complex historical and symbolic background. In European folklore, fireplaces represented the domestic heart, the site of warmth, sustenance, and communal gathering. By associating Santa's arrival with the chimney, families merged symbolic and practical concerns. The chimney allowed for a magical narrative of secretive gift delivery while maintaining focus on the hearth as a locus of domestic life. The image of Santa descending through the chimney evokes mystery, wonder, and the blending of the ordinary with the fantastical, a theme central to domestic ritual. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these practices had become widely codified and recognized across American households. Stories, periodicals, and children's literature depicted decorated mantles, hung stockings, and cookies left for Santa, reinforcing the performative and participatory aspects of the ritual. These narratives encourage replication, providing households with concrete models for domestic observance while embedding the rituals within broader cultural and moral frameworks. Stockings themselves became sites of creativity and expression. Families embroidered initials, decorated fabrics, or crafted ornaments that reflected local styles, family identity, and seasonal motifs. Each stocking could tell a story of a child's growth, a family's values, or a community's shared aesthetic sensibilities.
This customization reinforced the intimate and personal dimensions of the ritual, highlighting the interplay between standardized tradition and individual expression. Gifts placed within stockings were typically small, thoughtful, and symbolic. Early American examples included handmade toys, sweets, coins, or practical items such as mittens or combs. The act of placing these items encouraged reflection on generosity, thoughtfulness, and moral consideration. The giver considered not merely the material value, but the significance of the gift in nurturing familial and communal bonds. This emphasis on meaning over extravagance is a hallmark of domestic ritual, illustrating how cultural practices cultivate ethical reflection and emotional connection. Other domestic rituals complemented stockings and chimneys, contributing to a holistic seasonal experience. Children might participate in making paper chains, decorating small evergreen branches, or preparing cookies and treats for Santa and household members. Families engaged in storytelling, singing carols, or reading holiday-themed literature, creating immersive environments in which imagination, memory, and moral reflection intersected. These practices emphasize the home as a sacred space for communal engagement, teaching, and the cultivation of seasonal atmosphere. The interplay between domestic ritual and public culture is also notable. While commercial depictions of Santa Claus, department store displays, and media representations popularized specific imagery and narratives, households retained autonomy in interpretation and adaptation. Families could incorporate new elements, reinterpret stories, or emphasize certain symbolic aspects according to local conditions, resources, and values. This flexibility allowed domestic rituals to remain meaningful and relevant even as the broader cultural context evolved. Material culture associated with these practices also reflect adaptation and creativity. Stockings might be crafted from accessible fabrics, personalized with embroidery or applique, or passed down through generations as heirlooms. Treats and small gifts often combined locally available ingredients with imported or specialty items, reflecting both practical limitations and aspirational desires. Hearths, mantles, and chimney decorations became canvases for imaginative expression, blending aesthetics, functionality, and symbolic resonance. Educational and moral dimensions of these domestic rituals were central. Through participation, children learned about anticipation, patience, kindness, and generosity. They developed narrative comprehension and imaginative engagement, connecting the fantastical elements of Santa's visit with real-world ethical principles. Parents and elders acted as guides, framing the rituals within moral and cultural context, ensuring that enjoyment was pairing with reflection and teaching. Over the 20th century, these rituals adapted to changing household structures, technological innovations, and social norms. Electric lights replaced candles, commercially produced stockings became widely available, and mass-produced small gifts complemented handmade items. Yet the core structure, the anticipation, the preparation, and the moment of discovery remained intact, illustrating the resilience and continuity of domestic ritual even amid modernization. Regional and cultural variations persisted. In some areas, children left shoes rather than stockings. In others might include local specialties or items reflecting immigrant heritage. Families integrated domestic rituals with broader community observances, such as church-based pageants or neighborhood gatherings, linking private practice with social engagement. These variations reflect the adaptive nature of tradition, capable of preserving symbolic coherence while accommodating diversity. The imaginative dimension of these domestic rituals also reinforced intergenerational transmission. Parents, grandparents, and extended family members shared stories, modeled behaviors, and guided children in preparation, creating layered experiences of participation, learning, and memory making. These interactions contributed to the persistence of ritual, embedding it in familial identity and shaping the emotional and ethical contours of childhood experience. Even small details, the placement of cookies, the timing of hanging stockings, or the selection of decorative elements were imbued with meaning. These choices reflected attention, care, and deliberate cultivation of atmosphere, demonstrating how domestic ritual functions not merely as repetition, but as a form of creative and reflective engagement. In this way, everyday practices were elevated into culturally and emotionally significant acts, transforming the home into a space of seasonal magic and ethical reflection.
The rise of commercial Christmas in the 20th century. The 20th century witnessed a dramatic transformation in the cultural and economic landscape of Christmas. What had historically been a primarily religious and domestic celebration gradually evolved into a holiday deeply entwined with commerce, consumer culture, and mass marketing. While family gatherings, religious observance, and festive ritual remained central, commercial forces began to shape the ways in which Americans experienced and perceived the holiday, producing a phenomenon now recognized as the commercial Christmas. Several factors contributed to this evolution: industrialization, urbanization, and the expansion of mass production created a growing supply of goods that could be sold as Christmas gifts. The rise of department stores, mail-order catalogs, and later nationwide retail chains provided both the infrastructure and opportunity to promote consumer engagement. These developments were accompanied by marketing innovations, including advertisements, window displays, and media campaigns, which actively associated material acquisition with the enjoyment and spirit of the holiday. The role of media in shaping commercial Christmas cannot be overstated. Newspapers, magazines, and radio programs presented images, stories, and advertisements that standardized visual and narrative motifs of the season. From depictions of Santa Claus to portrayals of beautifully decorated homes and lavish gifts, media representations created aspirational ideals for celebration. Consumers were invited not merely to observe Christmas, but to participate in a culturally codified experience mediated by products, displays, and imagery. Retailers strategically employed Santa Claus, elves, and other symbolic figures to bridge tradition and commerce. Santa's presence in department stores, catalog illustrations, and advertisements provided both familiarity and excitement, linking ethical, moral, and imaginative engagement with the act of purchasing and gift-giving. Children's anticipation of Santa's arrival was harnessed to encourage family spending, while parents' desire to meet cultural expectations of generosity and display reinforced commercial activity. This interplay demonstrates the nuanced interaction between cultural tradition and economic incentive. The development of Christmas cards in the late 19th and early 20th centuries further contributed to commercialization. Greeting cards offered an opportunity for personal expression, social connection, and moral reflection, while simultaneously creating a market for mass-produced, aesthetically appealing products. The practice of sending cards, combined with the exchange of gifts, decorations, and other seasonal items, established a framework in which consumption became an integral, normalized aspect of celebration. Advertising campaigns amplified this trend, creating narratives that linked consumer goods with familial warmth, happiness, and moral virtue. Products were framed as essential to authentic celebration. Toys for children, festive decorations, gourmet food, and specialty clothing were presented as means of cultivating joy and maintaining social norms. The commercialization of Christmas thus operated not merely as economic activity, but as a cultural mechanism, shaping perceptions, expectations, and social practices. Department store window displays became particularly influential in promoting commercial Christmas. Elaborate tableaus featuring animated figures, miniature towns, and seasonal spectacles drew crowds, creating immersive environments that combined entertainment, aspiration, and advertisement.
Children and families visiting these displays participated in a cultural ritual that merged observation, imaginative engagement, and consumer influence, blurring the boundaries between domestic celebration and public spectacle. The expansion of mass production further facilitated commercialization. Toy manufacturers, confectors, and household goods producers capitalized on the heightened demand during the holiday season. Marketing strategies emphasized novelty, collectability, and aesthetic appeal, encouraging repeated engagement and fostering consumer habits that extended beyond the immediate season. In this way, the commercial dimension of Christmas became a cyclical and self-reinforcing feature of American cultural life. The symbolic landscape of the holiday was also adapted to support commercial aims. Santa Claus, reindeer, decorated trees, and festive motifs were integrated into product design, packaging, and promotion, ensuring that visual and narrative elements of tradition supported economic activity. These symbols functioned both to maintain continuity with historical observance and to legitimize the act of purchasing, transforming consumption into a culturally sanctioned and emotionally meaningful practice. Regional and demographic variation influenced how commercial Christmas manifested. Urban centers with department stores and high-density populations experienced more pronounced commercial displays, while rural areas adapted practices to local resources and social norms. Yet even in geographically dispersed communities, the combination of media, mail-order catalogs, and mass-produced goods ensured widespread engagement, creating a national culture of consumption linked to Christmas. The psychological and social impact of commercialization was significant. Consumers internalized cultural expectations regarding gift-giving, decoration, and celebration, often measuring the adequacy of their observances against standardized ideals promoted in media and advertisement. Children and adults alike experienced both excitement and pressure, linking emotional and ethical dimensions of celebration with participation in commercial networks. In this sense, the rise of commercial Christmas reflects the broader integration of cultural practice with economic, psychological, and social mechanisms. The relationship between tradition and commercialization was not uniformly resisted or embraced. While some observers decried the materialization of Christmas, others recognized the potential for new forms of creativity, engagement, and expression. Commercial products facilitated participation in domestic ritual, expanded access to aesthetic and material experiences, and provided opportunities for imaginative engagement with symbolic elements of the holiday. The coexistence of domestic ritual and commercial enterprise illustrates the complex negotiation between ethical, emotional, and economic dimensions of cultural life. Cultural institutions, including schools, churches, and civic organizations, engaged with commercial Christmas in ways that reinforced social cohesion while accommodating economic activity. Charity drives, gift exchanges, and communal celebrations provided frameworks within which consumption could be morally and socially meaningful, linking the act of purchasing or gifting with broader ethical and communal purposes. In this way, commercialization did not entirely supplant traditional values, but rather intersected with them, producing hybrid practices that combined commerce, ritual, and moral reflection. Technological innovations of the 20th century further reinforced commercialization. Advances in transportation, refrigeration, and packaging expanded the variety and accessibility of products, while mass communication technologies, radio, television, and film, promoted standardized imagery and narratives. These developments created a feedback loop in which media representation, consumer expectation, and market supply mutually reinforced one another, embedding commercial activity deeply within the cultural structure of Christmas. The aesthetic and symbolic elements of commercial Christmas were also shaped by evolving consumer preferences. Advertising emphasized color, novelty, and spectacle, while products were designed to evoke emotion, anticipation, and delight. These strategies enhanced both engagement and satisfaction, ensuring that commercial participation was experienced not merely as transactional, but as culturally meaningful and emotionally resonant. Family dynamics and social practices adapted to the rise of commercial Christmas. Gift giving became increasingly organized and stratified with attention to social norms, age-specific desires, and perceived merit. Household decoration expanded to include lighting, ornaments, and other commercially produced items, reinforcing both the visual and emotional impact of celebration. Children's interaction with Santa, media representations, and household preparation created immersive experiences, linking domestic ritual with public culture and commercial networks. By mid-century, commercial Christmas had become a central feature of American cultural life, shaping the rhythms, expectations, and practices of the holiday across social, geographic, and economic boundaries. While religious observance and domestic ritual remained important, consumption was now inseparable from the seasonal experience, influencing perception, behavior, and emotional engagement. The commercial dimension thus represents both a continuation and transformation of historical practices, integrating material culture into symbolic, ethical, and aesthetic frameworks.
How traditions change during times of war and hardship. Throughout history, cultural traditions rarely exist in a vacuum. They are continually shaped and reshaped by broader social, economic, and political forces. Christmas, with its rich array of domestic rituals, religious observances, and communal celebrations, is no exception. During periods of war and hardship, the practices associated with Christmas adapted to reflect the constraints, anxieties, and moral imperatives of the times, demonstrating the flexibility, resilience, and enduring significance of festive tradition. The impact of war on Christmas traditions is particularly evident during the 20th century. The First World War introduced unprecedented social and economic disruption, affecting households across Europe and the United States. Material scarcity, rationing, and the absence of family members serving in the armed forces necessitated adjustments in the celebration of the holiday. Gift giving was curtailed or simplified, while families emphasized symbolic, handmade, or modest offerings, maintaining the moral and emotional significance of generosity despite economic limitations. At the same time, wartime conditions fostered communal innovation. Local communities organized public celebrations, charitable drives, and social gatherings to maintain the spirit of Christmas. Churches and civic organizations played central roles, providing resources, organizing events, and offering spaces for collective observation. These efforts not only preserved festive practices, but also reinforced social cohesion, offering a sense of stability, shared purpose, and emotional continuity in the face of uncertainty. During the Second World War, similar patterns emerged, but on a larger and more complex scale. Rationing of food, clothing, and household goods forced families to creatively adapt domestic rituals. Homemade decorations, locally sourced treats, and modest gifts became central to the observance of the holiday. Children participated in crafting ornaments, wrapping presents from available materials, and engaging in imaginative play that substituted for commercially purchased goods. These practices emphasized resourcefulness, patience, and moral reflection, aligning domestic ritual with broader social imperatives of frugality and solidarity. Letters to soldiers abroad and support for troops also became integrated into Christmas tradition during wartime. Families encouraged children to create cards, write letters, and send small gifts to members of the military, linking domestic ritual with civic engagement and ethical responsibility. These practices transform the holiday into a vehicle for moral education, communal participation, and symbolic continuity, demonstrating how festive observance can adapt meaningfully to extraordinary circumstances.
The content and style of gift-giving were similarly influenced by hardship. In place of expensive or imported items, families emphasized symbolic value, practical utility, and handmade craftsmanship. A knitted scarf, a carefully crafted toy, or a simple baked treat carried emotional and cultural significance that rivaled that of more extravagant commercial gifts. This shift highlighted an enduring feature of Christmas, its capacity to convey moral and emotional meaning independent of material wealth. Public celebrations, too, were affected by war and economic constraint. Civic parades, public concerts, and elaborate displays were scaled back or repurposed to align with wartime priorities. In some cases, community events were infused with patriotic messaging, linking festive observation to national morale, support for the armed forces, and the cultivation of civic identity. These adaptations illustrate the malleability of tradition, capable of both preserving continuity and reflecting contemporary social realities. Music, storytelling, and performance remain central to sustaining festive culture during times of hardship. Caroling, community concerts, and church services provided opportunities for collective engagement, reinforcing shared values and emotional connection even amid adversity. Songs, stories, and performances were often adapted to reflect themes of hope, endurance, and moral courage, linking celebration to cultural and ethical reflection. Through these activities, communities maintained a sense of seasonal rhythm, cultural identity, and emotional continuity even amid adversity. The visual and material culture of Christmas was similarly adapted. Decorations often relied on available resources, including paper, fabric scraps, and natural materials. Evergreen boughs, holly, and other local foliage replaced imported goods, reinforcing both aesthetic and symbolic continuity. Lighting, often powered by limited electricity or simple candles, created intimate and meaningful domestic atmospheres, emphasizing the experiential and participatory dimensions of ritual over material abundance. Children's experiences of Christmas during times of war and hardship were shaped by both limitation and imagination. The absence of commercial abundance encouraged creative play, storytelling, and engagement with symbolic and domestic elements of the holiday. Children learned to value emotional connection, moral reflection, and imaginative participation over material reward, illustrating the adaptive capacity of cultural transmission even under challenging circumstances. The broader social function of Christmas was also heightened during periods of crisis. Ritualized observance provided psychological stability, ethical orientation, and communal solidarity. Communities used the holiday as a means of reinforcing social norms, providing comfort, and fostering intergenerational transmission of values. In this sense, Christmas acted as a stabilizing cultural mechanism, ensuring continuity, emotional engagement, and moral reflection despite material or social disruption. The experience of hardship and adaptation reinforced the moral and symbolic dimensions of the holiday. Acts of generosity, reflection on ethical conduct, and attention to communal well-being were emphasized, reflecting the capacity of tradition to transmit values beyond mere aesthetic or commercial expression. This dimension underscores a central feature of Christmas as a cultural practice: its ability to convey ethical meaning, emotional resonance, and communal identity even in the absence of abundance. Internationally, wartime adaptations reflected both shared challenges and local cultural variation. In Europe, for example, rationing, displacement, and social disruption shaped the celebration of Christmas in distinctive ways, while still maintaining essential features of ritual, symbolism, and communal engagement. In the United States, the experience of economic depression during the 1930s similarly influenced domestic practice, emphasizing creativity, frugality, and moral instruction alongside celebration. These examples illustrate the universal capacity of Christmas traditions to adapt meaningfully to social, economic, and political circumstances. Religious observance, likewise, remains central. Churches emphasize the spiritual dimensions of the holiday, reinforcing moral reflection, collective prayer, and ethical teaching. Liturgical practices were maintained or adapted to suit local and national conditions, ensuring that even amid hardship, the ethical and spiritual essence of the holiday remained accessible and meaningful. Religious guidance provided a framework for interpreting and enacting domestic and communal ritual, linking moral understanding with cultural practice. Economic hardship also fostered innovation in domestic and community celebration. Families engaged in crafting decorations, baking with limited ingredients, and improvising small gifts, creating personalized and emotionally resonant observances. Communities organized cooperative celebrations, shared resources, and coordinated charitable activities, embedding social solidarity and mutual support within festive practice. These adaptations highlight the flexibility and resilience of cultural tradition, capable of sustaining both meaning and enjoyment in adverse circumstances.
War and hardship also prompted reflection on the ethical dimensions of consumption and celebration. The contrast between abundance and scarcity sharpened moral awareness, encouraging generosity, empathy, and ethical consideration in both private and public contexts. Children and adults alike were taught to value participation, intention, and imaginative engagement over material acquisition, reinforcing enduring cultural principles of Christmas observance. By integrating practical adaptation, ethical reflection, and imaginative engagement, communities ensured that the spirit of Christmas persisted even under extraordinary constraints. Domestic rituals, public observances, and symbolic practices were recalibrated to suit circumstances without losing their cultural, moral, or emotional resonance. This capacity for adaptation demonstrates both the resilience and enduring significance of festive tradition. Ultimately, periods of war and hardship shaped not only the form, but the meaning of Christmas. The holiday became a vehicle for moral education, emotional sustenance, communal solidarity, and cultural continuity. Families, communities, and institutions creatively navigated constraints, ensuring that celebration remained both meaningful and accessible. These adaptations highlight a central characteristic of Christmas: its capacity to endure, adapt, and convey symbolic and ethical significance across changing historical contexts. Conclusion: reflecting on the hidden layers of Christmas. As we step back from the many centuries of Christmas observance, it becomes strikingly clear that the holiday is far more than the sum of its visible parts. The decorated trees, the stockings by the hearth, the jingling of bells, and the sight of Santa Claus descending chimneys are not merely festive trappings. They are the culmination of countless generations of cultural adaptation, moral teaching, and imaginative engagement. Beneath the cheerful surface of modern celebration lies a network of historical influences, social negotiation, and deeply embedded human meaning. From its earliest origins, Christmas has served as a mirror for society, reflecting prevailing values, anxieties, and aspirations. The ancient solstice festivals marked the cyclical return of light, offering communities both comfort and hope during the darkest months of the year. Early pagan rituals, with their emphasis on fire, greenery, and communal feasting, sought to reconcile humanity with the natural world and instill a sense of continuity amid seasonal uncertainty. These practices provided the scaffolding upon which later Christian observances would build, integrating familiar rituals into the new religious framework. Christianity, in absorbing these older customs, layered additional moral and spiritual significance onto existing seasonal observances. The narrative of the Nativity introduced a narrative of hope, redemption, and divine generosity, reinforcing ethical reflection and communal responsibility. Over time, these spiritual elements merged with local folklore, legend, and regional practice, creating a diverse yet coherent tapestry of celebration.
St. Nicholas, Yule customs, caroling, and household rituals each contributed threads to this intricate pattern, providing continuity, symbolic depth, and moral resonance across generations. By the medieval period, Christmas had become both a communal and domestic experience. Feasts, pageants, and public celebrations were accompanied by intimate household rituals. Children hung stockings, families prepared special foods, and communities engaged in music and storytelling. These practices emphasized participation, imagination, and ethical reflection, demonstrating that the holiday's power lay not merely in spectacle, but in lived experience. The home, hearth, and family became central sites where tradition was performed, internalized, and transmitted. The evolution of Santa Claus into a universal icon illustrates the layered interplay between folklore, literature, art, and commerce. Figures such as Thomas Nast and Haddon Sundblom synthesized centuries of depiction into a single, cohesive image, jolly, generous, and imbued with moral and emotional significance. Through newspapers, magazines, and advertising, this image achieved unprecedented cultural visibility, shaping both public expectation and private ritual. Yet even as commercialization intensified, domestic practice retained its ethical, imaginative, and symbolic dimensions, ensuring that participation remained meaningful beyond the act of consumption. Domestic rituals themselves reveal the hidden depth of Christmas. Stockings, chimneys, tree decoration, and gift-giving operate on multiple levels. They entertain, they educate, and they reinforce moral and social values. Children learn patience, generosity, and ethical reflection. Families engage in creativity, resourcefulness, and shared storytelling. The seemingly simple act of placing a small gift in a stocking embodies centuries of moral instruction, imaginative play, and cultural continuity. Even in periods of scarcity, war, or economic hardship, these practices persisted, emphasizing emotional and ethical meaning over material abundance. The rise of commercial Christmas in the 20th century added another layer of complexity. Retailers, mass media, and advertising amplified visibility, standardized imagery, and encouraged material participation. Department store windows, catalogs, and mass-produced gifts became sites of both cultural negotiation and imaginative engagement. Yet these commercial elements did not fully replace domestic or ethical practice. Instead, they intersected with it, providing new forms of expression and avenues for participation. Families adapted, appropriated, and personalized commercial symbols, ensuring that tradition remained rooted in lived experience. Wartime and hardship further highlight the flexibility and resilience of Christmas. Across Europe and America, families adapted rituals to scarcity, rationing, and absence, creating homemade decorations, thoughtful gifts, and imaginative play to preserve the essence of celebration. Communities organized charitable drives, public gatherings, and collective observances, reinforcing solidarity and moral reflection. In these contexts, the holiday demonstrated its capacity to sustain meaning and hope even under extraordinary constraints, emphasizing that celebration is as much about intention, imagination, and participation as it is about material display. Music, storytelling, and narrative imagery also play a vital role in revealing the hidden layers of Christmas. Carols, hymns, and popular songs link historical memory with contemporary experience, reinforcing emotional resonance and cultural continuity. Narratives surrounding Santa, gift-giving, and domestic ritual provide frameworks for moral reflection, imaginative engagement, and communal bonding. Through repeated performance and transmission, these stories and songs embed themselves in consciousness, ensuring that the holiday's symbolic and ethical dimensions endure alongside its visual and material culture. The multi-layered nature of Christmas also underscores the role of human agency. Families, communities, and individuals actively shape celebration through creative adaptation, ethical engagement, and imaginative practice. Ritual is not passively received. It is enacted, interpreted, and transmitted. Each act of decorating, each gesture of gift-giving, each performance of song or story contributes to a living tradition, connecting past generations to present experience and future continuity. Globalization and cross-cultural exchange have added further dimensions. Images, stories, and rituals travel across borders, blending with local customs, aesthetics, and practices. The American conception of Santa Claus, the Christmas tree, and popular music have influenced celebrations worldwide, while local adaptations ensure that diversity and local meaning persist. This dynamic interplay between global standardization and local variation highlights both the reach and flexibility of Christmas traditions. At its core, the enduring appeal of Christmas lies in the intertwining of ethical, emotional, and imaginative elements. Material practices, gifts, decorations, feasts are always accompanied by moral and social instruction, generosity, reflection, empathy, and communal connection. Imaginative engagement, whether through stories, play, or ritual performance, reinforces memory, emotional attachment, and cultural literacy. Together, these layers create a holistic, meaningful, and resilient celebration. The hidden layers of Christmas also invite reflection on historical continuity. Each element, ancient solstice observances, medieval rituals, Puritan adaptations, Victorian innovations, 20th century commercialization, carries echoes of previous centuries. The holiday is a palimpsest, with new inscriptions overlaying older ones, yet traces of the past remain visible, informing practice, shaping expectation, and enriching meaning. Recognition of this continuity deepens understanding, offering perspective on both cultural history and contemporary experience. As a cultural practice, Christmas demonstrates the interdependence of tradition, imagination, and social context. Ritual and narrative are inseparable from the ethical and emotional frameworks within which they operate. Material culture, media representation, and commercial influence intersect with domestic practice, storytelling, and communal engagement, producing a celebration that is simultaneously personal, social, historical, and symbolic. Ultimately, reflecting on these hidden layers encourages a deeper appreciation of the holiday. Christmas is not merely a season of decoration, consumption, or spectacle. It is a living tradition, shaped by centuries of human creativity, moral reflection, and imaginative engagement. Every ornament, every carol, every story, and every gesture of giving carries with it centuries of history, moral reflection, and imaginative effort, inviting us to participate not merely as observers, but as active inheritors and